This is Audible.
Audible Inc. presents The Bonobo and the Atheist. Written by Franz de Waal. Narrated by Jonathan Davis. Chapter 1. Earthly Delights. Is man only a blunder of God, or is God only a blunder of man? Friedrich Nietzsche. I was born in Den Bosch, the Dutch city after which Hieronymus Bosch named himself. This doesn't make me an expert on the painter, but, having grown up with his statue on the market square, I have always been fond of his surrealist imagery, his symbolism, and how it relates to humanity's place in the universe under a waning influence of God. His famous triptych, in which naked figures frolic around, The Garden of Earthly Delights, is a tribute to paradisiacal innocence. The middle tableau is far too happy and relaxed to fit the interpretation of depravity and sin advanced by Puritan experts. It shows humanity free from guilt and shame, either before the fall or without any fall at all. For a primatologist like myself, the nudity, the allusions to sex and fertility, the plentiful birds and fruits, and the moving about in groups are thoroughly familiar, and hardly in need of a religious or moral interpretation. Bosch seems to have depicted us in our natural state, while reserving his moralistic outlook for the right-hand panel, in which he punishes not the frolickers from the middle panel, but monks, nuns, gluttons, gamblers, warriors, and drunkards. Bosch was no fan of the clergy and their avarice, which explains a small detail in which a man resists signing his fortune away to a pig veiled like a Dominican nun. The poor figure is said to be the painter himself. 5 centuries later, we remain embroiled in debates about the place of religion in society. As in Bosch's day, the central theme is morality. Can we envision a world without God? Would this world be good? Don't think for a moment that the current battle lines between fundamentalist Christianity and science are determined by evidence. One has to be pretty immune to data to doubt evolution, which is why books and documentaries aimed at convincing the skeptics are a waste of effort. They are helpful for those prepared to listen, but fail to reach their target audience. The debate is less about the truth than about how to handle it. For those who believe that morality comes straight from God the Creator, acceptance of evolution would open a moral abyss. Listen to the Reverend Al Sharpton debating the late atheist firebrand Christopher Hitchens. If there is no order to the universe, and therefore some being, some force that ordered it, then who determines what is right or wrong? There is nothing immoral if there's nothing in charge. Similarly, I have heard people echo Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov, exclaiming, "If there is no God, I am free to rape my neighbor." Perhaps it's just me, but I'm wary of any persons whose belief system is the only thing standing between them and repulsive behavior. Why not assume that our humanity, including the self-control needed for a livable society, is built into us? Does anyone truly believe that our ancestors lacked social norms before they had religion? Did they never assist others in need or complain about an unfair deal? Humans must have worried about the functioning of their communities well before current religions arose, which occurred only a couple of millennia ago. Biologists are unimpressed by that kind of timescale. The Dalai Lama's Turtle. The aforementioned introduced a blog entitled Morals Without God on the New York Times website, in which I argue that morality antedates religion, and that much can be learned about origin by considering our fellow primates. Contrary to the customary blood-soaked view of nature, animals are not devoid of tendencies that we morally approve of, which to me suggests that morality is not as much of a human innovation as we like to think. This being the topic of the present book, Let me lay out its themes by describing the week that followed my blog's publication, including a trip to Europe. Right before this, however, I attended a meeting between science and religion at Emory University in Atlanta, where I work. The occasion was a forum with the Dalai Lama on his favorite theme, compassion. Being compassionate seems to me an excellent recommendation for life. Hence, I welcome the message of our honorable guest. As the first discussant, I was seated next to him surrounded by a sea of red and yellow chrysanthemums. I had been instructed to address him as Your Holiness, but to speak of him to others as His Holiness, which I found sufficiently confusing that I avoided all forms of address. One of the most admired men on the planet dropped his shoes and folded his legs under him in his chair, put on a huge baseball cap color match to his orange robe, while an audience of over 3,000 people hung on his every word. Before my presentation, I had been appropriately deflated by the organizers reminding me that no one had come to hear me speak, and that all those people were there only for his pearls of wisdom. In my remarks, I reviewed the latest evidence for animal altruism. For example, apes will voluntarily open a door to offer a companion access to food, even if they lose part of it in the process. And capuchin monkeys are prepared to seek rewards for others, as we see when we place two of them side by side, while one of them barters with us with differently colored tokens. One token rewards only the monkey itself, whereas the other rewards both monkeys. Soon the monkeys prefer the pro-social token. This is not out of fear, because dominant monkeys, who have least to fear, are in fact the most generous. Good deeds also occur spontaneously. An old female peony spends her days outdoors with other chimpanzees at the Yerkes Primate Center's field station. On bad days, when her arthritis is flaring up, she has trouble walking and climbing, but other females help her out. Peony may be huffing and puffing to get up into the climbing frame in which several apes have gathered for a grooming session, but an unrelated younger female moves behind her, placing both hands on her ample behind to push her up with quite a bit of effort until Peony has joined the rest. We have also seen Peony get up and slowly move toward the water spigot, which is at quite a distance. Younger females sometimes run ahead of her, take in some water, then return to Peony and give it to her. At first we had no idea what was going on, since all we saw was one female placing her mouth close to Peony's. But after a while the pattern became clear. Peony would open her mouth wide, and the younger female would spit a jet of water into it. Such observations fit the emerging field of animal empathy, which deals not only with primates, but also with canines, elephants, and even rodents. A typical example is how chimpanzees console distressed parties, hugging and kissing them, which is so predictable that we have documented literally thousands of cases. Mammals are sensitive to each other's emotions and react to those in need. The whole reason people fill their homes with furry carnivores, and not with, say, iguanas and turtles, is that mammals offer something no reptile ever will. They give affection. They want affection, and they respond to our emotions the way we do to theirs. Up to this point, the Dalai Lama had listened attentively, but now he lifted his cap to interrupt me. He wanted to hear more about turtles. These animals are a favorite of his because they supposedly carry the world on their backs. The Buddhist leader wondered whether turtles, too, know empathy. He described how the female sea turtle crawls onto land to look for the best spot to lay her eggs, thus showing concern for future young. How would the mother behave if she ever encountered her offspring? The Dalai Lama wondered. To me, the process suggests that turtles have been pre-programmed to seek out the best environment for incubation. The turtle digs a hole in the sand above the tide line, deposits her eggs and covers them, packing the sand tight with her rear flippers, and then leaves the nest behind. The hatchlings emerge a few months later to rush to the ocean under the moonlight. They never get to know their mother. Empathy requires awareness of the other and sensitivity to the other's needs. It probably started with parental care, like that found in the mammals, but there is also evidence for bird empathy. I once visited the Konrad Lorenz Research Station in Grunau, Austria, which keeps ravens in large aviaries. These are impressive birds, especially when they sit on your shoulder with their powerful black beak right next to your face. It brought back memories of the tame jackdaws I had kept as a student, much smaller birds from the same corvid crow family. In Grunau, the scientists follow spontaneous fights among the ravens and have seen bystanders respond to distress. Losers can count on some cozy preening or beak-to-beak nudging from their friends. At the same station, free-ranging descendants of Lawrence's flock of geese have been equipped with transmitters to measure their heart rate. Since every adult goose has a mate, that offers a window on empathy. If one bird confronts another in a fight, its partner's heart starts racing. Even if the partner is in no way involved, its heart betrays concern about the quarrel. Birds, too, feel each other's pain. If both birds and mammals have some measure of empathy, that capacity probably goes back to their reptilian ancestors. Not just any reptiles, though, because most lack parental care. One of the surest signs of a caring attitude, according to Paul MacLean, the American neuroscientist who named the limbic system the seat of the emotions, is the lost call of young animals. Young monkeys do it all the time. Left behind by mom, they call until she returns. They look miserable, sitting all alone on a tree limb, giving a long string of plaintive, cool calls with pouted lips directed at no one in particular. MacLean noted the absence of the lost call in most reptiles, such as snakes, lizards, and turtles. In a few reptiles, however, the young do call when upset or in danger, so that mom will take care of them. Have you ever held a baby alligator? Be careful, because they have a good set of teeth, but they also utter throaty barks when upset, which may bring the cow, mother, flying out of the water. That will teach you to doubt reptilian feelings. I mentioned this to the Dalai Lama, saying that we expect empathy only in animals with attachments, and that few reptiles qualify. I'm not sure this satisfied him, because of course he wanted to know about turtles, which look so much cuter than those ferocious, toothy monsters of the crocodilian family. Appearances are deceptive, though. Some members of this family gently transport their young in their big jaws or on their backs and defend them against danger. They sometimes even let them snatch pieces of meat from their mouth. The dinosaurs, too, cared for their young. And plesiosaurs, giant marine reptiles, may even have been viviparous, giving birth to a single live offspring in the water as whales do today. From everything we know, the smaller the number of offspring an animal produces, the better it will take care of them, which is why plesiosaurs are thought to have been doting parents. So, by the way, are birds, which science regards as feathered dinosaurs. Pressing me even further, the Dalai Lama jumped to butterflies and asked about their empathy, upon which I couldn't resist joking. They don't have time. They live just one day. The short life of butterflies is actually a myth, but whatever these insects feel about each other, I doubt it has much to do with empathy. This is not to minimize the larger thrust behind the Dalai Lama's question, which was that all animals do what is best for themselves and their offspring. In this case, all life is caring, perhaps not consciously caring, but caring nonetheless. He was getting at the idea that compassion goes to the root of what life is all about. Greeting Mama. After this, the forum moved on to other topics, such as how to measure compassion in the brains of Buddhist monks who have meditated on it all their lives. Richard Davidson from the University of Wisconsin related how monks straight from Tibet balked at his invitation to submit to neuroscience, since clearly compassion didn't take place in the brain but in the heart. Everyone felt this was hilarious, and the monks in the audience shrieked with laughter. But the monks had a point. Davidson subsequently discovered the connection between mind and heart. Compassion meditation brings about a quicker heart rate upon hearing sounds of human suffering. I had to think of the geese. But I also sat there wondering at this auspicious meeting of minds. In 2005, the Dalai Lama himself had spoken about the need to integrate science and religion, telling thousands of scientists at the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroscience in Washington how much trouble society has in keeping up with their groundbreaking research. It is all too evident that our moral thinking simply has not been able to keep pace with such rapid progress in our acquisition of knowledge and power. What a refreshing departure from attempts to drive a wedge between religion and science. This topic was on my mind as I prepared for Europe. I had barely received a blessing and a kata, a long white silk scarf around my neck, and seen the Dalai Lama off in his limousine with heavily armed guards, and I was on my way to Ghent, a beautiful old city in the Flemish part of Belgium. This region is culturally closer to the southern part of the Netherlands, where I am from, than the part to the north that we call Holland. All of us speak the same language, but Holland is Calvinist, whereas the southern provinces were kept Catholic in the 16th century by the Spanish, who brought us the Duke of Alva and the Inquisition. Not the silly, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition of Monty Python, but one that would put actual thumbscrews on you if you so much as doubted Mary's virginity. Not allowed to draw blood, the inquisitors loved the strappato, or reverse hanging, in which a victim is hung by wrists tied behind his back and a weight is attached to his ankles. This treatment is sufficiently debilitating that one soon abandons any preconceived notions about the link between sex and conception. Lately, the Vatican has been on a campaign to soften the Inquisition's image. They did not kill every heretic. They followed standard operating procedures. But the Jesuits in charge surely could have used some compassion training. This ancient history also explains, by the way, why one will look in vain for Bosch paintings in the lowlands. Most hang in the Prado in Madrid. It is thought that the Iron Duke obtained the garden when, in 1568, he declared the Prince of Orange an outlaw and confiscated all of his properties. The Duke then left the masterpiece to his son, from whom it went to the Spanish state. The Spanish adore the painter they call El Bosco, whose imagery inspired Joan Miró and Salvador Dalí. On my first visit to the Prado, I could not really enjoy Bosch's work, since all I could think was colonial plunder. To its credit, the museum has now digitized the popular painting at an incredibly high resolution, so that everyone can own it through Google Earth. After my lecture in Ghent, fellow scientists took me on an impromptu visit to the world's oldest zoo collection of bonobos, which started at Antwerp Zoo and is now located in the animal park at Plankendel. Given that bonobos are native to a former Belgian colony, their presence in Plankendel is hardly surprising. Bringing specimens from Africa, dead or alive, was another kind of colonial plunder, but without it, we might never have learned of this rare ape. The discovery took place in 1929 in a museum not far from here, when a German anatomist dusted off a small round skull labeled as that of a young chimp, which he recognized as an adult with an unusually small head. He quickly announced a new subspecies. Soon his claim was overshadowed, however, by the even more momentous pronouncement by an American anatomist that we had an entirely new species on our hands, one with a strikingly human-like anatomy. Bonobos are more gracefully built and have longer legs than any other ape. The species was put in the same genus, Pan, as the chimpanzee. For the rest of their long lives, both scientists illustrated the power of academic rivalry by never agreeing on who had made this historic discovery. I was in the room when the American stood up in the midst of a symposium on bonobos to declare, in a voice quavering with indignation, that he had been scooped half a century before. The German scientist had written in German and the American in English, so guess whose story is most widely cited. Many languages feel the pinch of the rise of English, but I was happily chatting in Dutch, which, despite decades abroad, still crosses my lips a fraction of a second faster than any other language. While a young bonobo swung on a rope in and out of view, getting our attention by hitting the glass each time he passed, we commented on how much his facial expression resembled human laughter. He was having fun, especially if we jumped back from the window, acting scared. We now found it impossible to imagine that the two Pan species were once mixed up. There is a famous photograph of the American expert Robert Yerkes with two young apes on his lap, both of whom he considered chimps. This was before the bonobo was known. Yerkes did remark how one of those two apes was far more sensitive and empathic than any other he knew, and perhaps also smarter. Calling him an anthropoid genius, he wrote his book Almost Human largely about this chimpanzee, not knowing that he was in fact dealing with one of the first live bonobos to have reached the West. The Plankendale colony shows the difference with chimpanzees right away, because it is led by a female. The biologist Jeroen Stevens told me how the atmosphere in the group had turned more relaxed since their long-time alpha female, who had been a real iron lady, had been sent off to another zoo. She had terrified most other bonobos, especially the males. The new alpha has a nicer character. The exchange of females between zoos is a new and commendable trend that fits the natural bonobo pattern. In the wild, sons stay with their mothers through adulthood, whereas daughters migrate to other places. For years, zoos had been moving males around, thus causing disaster upon disaster, because male bonobos get hammered in the absence of their mom. These poor males often ended up in isolation in an off-display area of zoos in order to protect their lives. A lot of problems are being avoided by keeping males with their mothers and respecting their bond. This goes to show that bonobos are no angels of peace. But it also indicates how much the males are mama's boys, something not everyone approves of. Some men feel affronted by matriarchal apes with wimpy males. After a lecture in Germany, a famous old professor in my audience barked, "Was ist wrong with those males?" It is the fate of the bonobo to have burst on the scientific scene at a time when anthropologists and biologists were busy emphasizing violence and warfare, and scarcely interested in peaceful primate kin. Since no one knew what to do with them, bonobos quickly became the black sheep of the human evolutionary literature. An American anthropologist went so far as to recommend that we simply ignore them, given that they're close to extinction anyway. Holding a species' imminent demise against it is extraordinary. Is something the matter with bonobos? Are they ill-adapted? Extinction says nothing about initial adaptiveness, though. The dodo was doing fine until sailors landed on Mauritius and found these flightless birds an easy if repugnant meal. Similarly, all of our ancestors must have been well adapted at some point, even though none of them is around anymore. Should we stop paying attention to them? But we never stop. The media go crazy each time a minuscule trace of our past is discovered. A reaction encouraged by personalized fossils with names like Lucy and Ardy. I welcome bonobos precisely because the contrast with chimpanzees enriches our view of human evolution. They show that our lineage is marked not just by male dominance and xenophobia, but also by a love of harmony and sensitivity to others. Since evolution occurs through both the male and the female lineage, there is no reason to measure human progress purely by how many battles our men have won against other hominins. Attention to the female side of the story would not hurt, nor would attention to sex. For all we know, we did not conquer other groups, but bred them out of existence through love rather than war. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA, and I wouldn't be surprised if we carry other hominin genes as well. Viewed in this light, the bonobo way doesn't seem so alien. Leaving those gentle apes behind, I next stopped at the Arnhem Zoo in the Netherlands, where I began my career with the other Pan species. The German professor would love chimpanzees, since males rule supremely and are constantly vying for position, so much so that I wrote an entire book, Chimpanzee Politics, on their schmoozing and scheming. As a student, I began to read Niccolò Machiavelli to gain insights that biology textbooks couldn't offer me. One of the central male characters of that tumultuous period, now 4 decades in the past, was murdered while I was still there, an event that continues to haunt me, not least because of the gruesome removal of his testicles by the attackers. The other male characters have all died over the years, but the colony still includes their adult sons, who not only look unnervingly like their fathers, but also sound like them when they hoot or scream. Chimps have distinctive voices. I used to be able to tell all 25 of them apart by their calls alone. I feel very much at home with these primates and consider them absolutely fascinating, but I never have any illusions about how nice they are, even if they look like it to most people. They take their power games very seriously and are ready to kill their rivals. That they sometimes kill humans or bite off their face, as has happened with pet chimps in the United States, is what you can expect if you keep a wild animal in a situation in which sexual jealousy and its dominance drive risk being aroused by our own feeble species. A single adult male chimpanzee has such muscle power, not to mention his dagger-like canine teeth and 4 hands, that even a team of 5 hefty men would never be able to hold him down. Chimps raised around people know this all too well. The females I knew in Arnhem are still around, however, especially the impressive matriarch of the colony named Mama. She was never like a bonobo matriarch who rules the place, but has been alpha among the females for as long as I remember. In her heyday, Mama was an active player in male power struggles. She would rally female support for one male or another, who would be in her debt if he managed to get to the top. This male would do well to stay on her good side, because if Mama turned against him, his career might be over. Mama went so far as to punish females who dared side with males she did not approve of, acting like a party whip. Chimpanzee males physically dominate females, but it is not as if females know nothing about politics or stay out of it. Females in wild communities often do, but on the island in Arnhem, this isn't an option. The result is a reduced power gap between the sexes. Since all females are present all the time, actively supporting each other, it is impossible for any male to get around the female power block. I have always been close to Mama, who greets me with a mixture of respect and affection each time she sees me. She did so already all those years ago, and still does so each time she detects my face in a crowd of visitors. I have been to the zoo every couple of years, and sometimes engage in a bit of friendly grooming with her. But this time I arrived with almost 100 people in tow, attendees of a symposium at the zoo's convention center. As we walked up to the chimp island, both Mama and another old female, Jimmy, hurried forward to greet me. They gave a series of low grunts, and Mama stretched out a hand to me from a distance. Females typically use this come-here gesture when they're about to move and want their offspring to jump on their back. I made the same gesture back at her and later helped the caretaker feed the chimpanzees by throwing fruit across the water moat, making sure that Mama, who walks slowly and isn't as skilled as the others at plucking flying oranges out of the air, got enough. Jealousy was on display right then and there, because Mama's adult daughter, Monique, snuck up on us to lob a heavy stone from a distance of about 40 feet. Monique's parabolic launch would have hit me in the head had I not kept an eye on her. I caught the rock in the air. Monique was born while I still worked at the zoo, and I have seen many times how she hates her mother's attention for me. She probably doesn't remember me, hence has no clue why Mama greets this stranger like an old friend. Better throw something at him. Since aimed throwing is viewed by some scholars as a human specialization related to language evolution, I have invited proponents of this theory to experience firsthand what chimps are capable of, but never had any volunteers. Perhaps they realize that stones may be replaced by smelly body products. Moved by the reunion between Mama and myself, the symposium participants wondered how well chimpanzees recognize us and how well we recognize them. For me, ape faces are as distinct as human faces, even though both species have a bias for their own kind. This bias was ignored not too long ago when only humans were considered good at face recognition. Apes had done poorly on the same tests as applied to humans with the same stimuli, which meant that the apes had been tested on human faces. I call this the anthropocentric bias in ape research, which is responsible for such misinformation. When one of my co-workers in Atlanta, Lisa Parr, used the hundreds of photographs I'd shot in Arnhem to test chimpanzees on portraits of their own species, they excelled at it. Seeing the portraits on a computer screen, they were even able to tell which juveniles were offspring of which females, doing so without personally knowing the pictured chimps. In the same way, leafing through a photo album, we can tell from the faces alone which humans are blood relatives. We live in a time of increasing acceptance of our kinship with the apes. True humanity never runs out of claims of what sets it apart, but it is a rare uniqueness claim that holds up for over a decade. If we consider our species without letting ourselves be blinded by the technical advances of the last few millennia, we see a creature of flesh and blood, with a brain that, albeit 3 times larger than a chimpanzee's, doesn't contain any new parts. Even our vaunted prefrontal cortex turns out to be of rather typical size compared with that of other primates. No one doubts the superiority of our intellect, but we have no basic wants or needs that are not also present in our close relatives. Just like us, monkeys and apes strive for power, enjoy sex, want security and affection, kill over territory, and value trust and cooperation. Yes, we have computers and airplanes, but our psychological makeup remains that of a social primate. This is why we had an entire symposium at the zoo on what healthcare professionals and social scientists might learn from primatology. I was the primatologist, of course, but learned something myself from a discussion on the side. We were talking about where morality gets its justification. If the weight behind it doesn't come from above, who or what provides it? A colleague noted that while the Dutch had become quite secular over the past few decades, there is a growing problem with moral authority. No one publicly corrects anyone anymore, and people have become less civilized as a result. I saw heads nodding around the table. Was this just a frustrated rant by the older generation, always ready to complain about the younger one? Or was there a pattern? Secularization is all around us in Europe, but its moral implications are poorly understood. Even the German political philosopher Jürgen Habermas, an atheist Marxist if there ever was one, has come to regard the loss of religion as perhaps not altogether beneficial. stating that something was lost when sin became guilt. The Atheist Dilemma. I am not convinced that morality needs to get its weight from above, though. Can't it come from within? This would certainly work for compassion, but perhaps also for our sense of fairness. A few years ago, we demonstrated that primates will happily perform a task for cucumber slices until they see others getting grapes, which taste so much better. The cucumber eaters become agitated, throw down their veggies, and go on strike. A perfectly fine food has become unpalatable as a result of seeing a companion get something better. We labeled it inequity aversion, a topic since investigated in other animals, including dogs. A dog will repeatedly perform a trick without rewards, but refuse as soon as another dog gets pieces of sausage for the same trick. Such findings have implications for human morality. According to most philosophers, we reason ourselves toward moral truths. Even if they don't invoke God, they're still proposing a top-down process in which we formulate the principles and then impose them on human conduct. But do moral deliberations really take place at such an elevated plane? Don't they need to be anchored in who and what we are? Would it be realistic, for example, to urge people to be considerate of others if we didn't already have a natural inclination to be so? Would it make sense to appeal to fairness and justice if we didn't have powerful reactions to their absence? Imagine the cognitive burden if every decision we took had to be vetted against handed-down logic. I am a firm believer in David Hume's position that reason is the slave of the passions. We started out with moral sentiments and intuitions, which is also where we find the greatest continuity with other primates. Rather than having developed morality from scratch through rational reflection, we received a huge push in the rear from our background as social animals. At the same time, however, I am reluctant to call a chimpanzee a moral being. This is because sentiments do not suffice. We strive for a logically coherent system and have debates about how the death penalty fits arguments for the sanctity of life, or whether an unchosen sexual orientation can be morally wrong. These debates are uniquely human. There is little evidence that other animals judge the appropriateness of actions that do not directly affect themselves. The great pioneer of morality research, the Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermark, explained that moral emotions are disconnected from one's immediate situation. They deal with good and bad at a more abstract, disinterested level. This is what sets human morality apart, a move toward universal standards combined with an elaborate system of justification, monitoring, and punishment. At this point, religion comes in. Think of the narrative support for compassion, such as the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the challenge to our sense of fairness, such as the parable of the workers in the vineyard, with its famous conclusion, "The last will be first, and the first will be last." Add to this an almost Skinnerian fondness of reward and punishment, from the virgins to be met in heaven to the hellfire awaiting sinners, and the exploitation of our desire to be praiseworthy, as Adam Smith called it. Humans are in fact so sensitive to public opinion that we only need to see a picture of two eyes glued to the wall to respond with good behavior. Religion understood this long ago, and uses the image of an all-seeing eye to symbolize an omniscient God. But even assigning such a modest role to religion is anathema for some. Over the past few years, we have gotten used to a strident atheism arguing that God is not great, Christopher Hitchens, or is a delusion, Richard Dawkins. The neo-atheists call themselves brights, thus implying that believers are not as bright. They have replaced St. Paul's view that non-believers live in darkness by its opposite. Non-believers are the only ones to have seen the light. Urging trust in science, they wish to root ethics in the naturalistic worldview. I do share their skepticism regarding religious institutions and their primates, popes, bishops, mega-preachers, ayatollahs, and rabbis, but what good could possibly come from insulting the many people who find value in religion? And more pertinently, what alternative does science have to offer? Science is not in the business of spelling out the meaning of life, and even less in telling us how to live our lives. The British philosopher John Gray put it as follows: "Science is not sorcery. The growth of knowledge enlarges what humans can do. It cannot reprieve them from being what they are." We scientists are good at finding out why things are the way they are, or how they work, and I do believe that biology helps us understand why morality looks the way it does. But to go from there to offering moral advice is a stretch. Even the staunchest atheist growing up in Western society cannot avoid having absorbed the basic tenets of Christianity. The increasingly secular Northern Europeans, whose cultures I know firsthand, consider themselves largely Christian in outlook. Everything humans have accomplished anywhere, from architecture to music, from art to science, developed hand in hand with religion, never separately. It is impossible, therefore, to know what morality would look like without religion. It would require a visit to a human culture that is not now and never was religious. That such cultures do not exist should give us pause. Bosch struggled with the same issue. Not with being an atheist, which was not an option, but with science's place in society. The little figures in his paintings with inverted funnels on their heads, or the background buildings in the form of distillation bottles and furnaces, reference chemical equipment. However we view science now, it is good to realize that it didn't start out as a very rational enterprise. Alchemy was gaining ground in Bosch's days, yet mixed with the occult and full of charlatans and quacks, which the painter depicted with great humor in front of their gullible audiences. Alchemy turned into empirical science only when it liberated itself from these influences and developed self-correcting procedures. But how science might contribute to a moral society remained unclear. Other primates, of course, have none of these problems, but even they strive for a certain kind of society. In their behavior, we recognize the same values we pursue ourselves. For example, female chimpanzees have been seen to drag reluctant males toward each other to make up after a fight, while removing weapons from their hands. Moreover, high-ranking males regularly act as impartial arbiters to settle disputes in the community. I take these hints of community concern as a sign that the building blocks of morality are older than humanity, and that we don't need God to explain how we got to where we are today. On the other hand, what would happen if we were to excise religion from society? I have trouble seeing how science and the naturalistic worldview could fill the void and become an inspiration for the good. At the end of my week-long transatlantic excursion, I found time on the plane back to read through the nearly 700 responses generated by my blog, Morals Without God. Most comments were constructive and supportive, expressing belief in shades of gray when it comes to the origins of morality. But atheists couldn't resist the occasion to make more digs at religion, thus bypassing my intentions. For me, understanding the need for religion is a far superior goal to bashing it. The central issue of atheism, which is the non-existence of God, strikes me as monumentally uninteresting. What do we gain by getting in a tizzy about the existence of something no one can prove or disprove? In 2012, Alain de Botton raised hackles by opening his book, Religion for Atheists, with the line, "The most boring and unproductive question one can ask of any religion is whether or not it is true. In terms of being handed down from heaven to the sound of trumpets, Yet for some this remains the only issue they can talk about. How did we reach this small-mindedness, as if we've joined a debating club where all one can do is win or lose? Science isn't the answer to everything. As a student, I learned about the naturalistic fallacy and how it would be the zenith of arrogance for scientists to think that their work could illuminate the distinction between right and wrong. This was not long after World War II, mind you, which had brought us massive evil justified by a scientific theory of self-directed evolution. Scientists had been very much involved in the genocidal machine, conducting unimaginable experiments. Children had been sewn together to create conjoined twins. Live humans had been operated on without anesthesia, and limbs and eyes had been surgically relocated on people's bodies. I have never forgotten this dark post-war period, during which every scientist who spoke with a German accent was suspect. American and British scientists were not innocent, however, because they were the ones who earlier in the century had brought us eugenics. They advocated racist immigration laws and forced sterilization of the deaf, blind, mentally ill, and physically impaired, as well as criminals and members of minority races. Surgeries to this effect were secretly performed on victims visiting the hospital for other reasons. For those who do not wish to blame this sordid history on science and prefer to speak of pseudoscience, it will be good to consider that eugenics was a serious academic discipline at many universities. By 1930, institutes devoted to it existed in England, Sweden, Switzerland, Russia, America, Germany, and Norway. Its theories were supported by prominent figures, including American presidents. Its founding father, the British anthropologist and polymath Sir Francis Galton, became a Fellow of the Royal Society and was knighted well after having espoused ideas about improving the human race. Notably, Galton felt that the average citizen was too base for the everyday work of modern civilization. It took Adolf Hitler and his henchmen to expose the moral bankruptcy of these ideas. The inevitable result was a precipitous drop of faith in science, especially biology. In the 1970s, biologists were still commonly equated with fascists, such as during the heated protest against sociobiology. As a biologist myself, I'm glad those acrimonious days are over. But at the same time, I wonder how anyone could forget this past and hail science as our moral savior. How did we move from deep distrust to naive optimism? While I do welcome a science of morality, my own work is part of it, I can't fathom calls for science to determine human values, as per the subtitle of Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape. Is pseudoscience something of the past? Are modern scientists free from moral biases? Think of the Tuskegee syphilis study of just a few decades ago, or the ongoing involvement of medical doctors in prisoner torture at Guantanamo Bay. I am profoundly skeptical of the moral purity of science, and feel that its role should never exceed that of morality's handmaiden. The confusion seems to stem from the illusion that all we need for a good society is more knowledge. Once we have figured out the central algorithm of morality, so the thinking goes, we can safely hand things over to science. Science will guarantee the best choices. This is a bit like thinking that a celebrated art critic must be a great painter or a food critic a great chef. After all, critics offer profound insights in regard to particular products. They possess the right knowledge, so why not let them handle the job? A critic's specialty, however, is post hoc evaluation, not creation, and creation takes intuition, skill, and vision. Even if science helps us appreciate how morality works, this doesn't mean it can guide it, any more than that someone who knows how eggs should taste can be expected to lay one. The view of morality as a set of immutable principles or laws that are ours to discover ultimately comes from religion. It doesn't really matter whether it is God, human reason, or science that formulates these laws. All of these approaches share a top-down orientation, their chief premise being that humans don't know how to behave and that someone must tell them. But what if morality is created in day-to-day social interaction, not at some abstract mental level? What if it is grounded in the emotions, which most of the time escape the neat categorizations that science is fond of? Since the whole point of my book is to argue a bottom-up approach, I will obviously return to this issue. My views are in line with the way we know the human mind works, with visceral reactions arriving before rationalizations, and also with the way evolution produces behavior. A good place to start is with an acknowledgement of our background as social animals, and how this background predisposes us to treat each other. This approach deserves attention at a time in which even avowed atheists are unable to wean themselves from a semi-religious morality, thinking that the world would be a better place if only a white-coated priesthood could take over from the frocked one. Chapter 2. Goodness Explained. The social instincts lead an animal to take pleasure in the society of its fellows, to feel a certain amount of sympathy with them, and to perform various services for them. Charles Darwin. Amos was one of the handsomest males I've known, except perhaps on the day he stuffed 2 entire apples in his mouth, which taught me again that chimpanzees can do things we can't. He had large eyes and a friendly, symmetrical face, a full, shiny coat of black hair, and well-defined muscles on arms and legs. He was never overly aggressive, as some males can be, yet supremely self-confident during his heyday. Amos was beloved. Some of us cried when he died, and his fellow apes were eerily silent for days. Their appetite took a hit. At the time, we didn't know what his problem was, but we learned post-mortem that in addition to a hugely enlarged liver that took up most of his abdomen, he had several cancerous growths. He had lost 15% of his weight from a year before, but even though his condition must have been building for years, he had acted normally until his body just couldn't hold out any longer. Amos must have felt miserable for months, but any sign of vulnerability would have meant loss of status. Chimps seemed to realize this. A limping male in the wild was seen to isolate himself for weeks to nurse his injuries, yet would show up now and then in the midst of his community to give a charging display full of vigor and strength, after which he'd withdraw again. That way no one would get any ideas. Amos didn't betray his condition until the day before his death, when we found him panting at a rate of 60 breaths per minute, with sweat pouring from his face, sitting on a burlap sack in one of the night cages, while the other chimps were outside in the sun. Amos refused to go out, so we kept him separate until a veterinarian could take a closer look. The other chimps kept returning indoors to check on him, though, so we cracked open the door behind which Amos sat to permit contact. Amos placed himself right next to the opening, and the female, Daisy, gently took his head to groom the soft spot behind his ears. Then she started pushing large amounts of excelsior through the crack. This is a wood shaving that chimps love to build nests with. They arrange it all around them and sleep on it. After Daisy had given Amos the wood wool, we saw a male do the same. Since Amos was sitting with his back against the wall and not doing much with the excelsior, Daisy reached in several times to stuff it between his back and the wall. This was remarkable. Didn't it suggest that Daisy realized that Amos must be uncomfortable, and that he would be better off leaning against something soft, similar to the way we arrange pillows behind a patient in the hospital. Daisy probably extrapolated from how she feels leaning against Excelsior, and indeed she is known among us as an Excelsior maniac. Instead of sharing the stuff, she normally hogs it. I am convinced that apes take the perspective of others, especially when it comes to friends in trouble. True, when such abilities have been tested in the laboratory, they have not always been confirmed, but those studies typically ask apes to understand humans in some artificial setting. I have already mentioned the anthropocentric bias of our science. In ape-to-ape tests of perspective-taking, chimpanzees have fared considerably better, and in the wild they attend to what others know or don't know. We shouldn't be surprised, therefore, that Daisy seemed to grasp Amos's situation. The next day Amos was put to sleep. There was no hope for survival, only the certainty of more pain. The incident illustrated two contrasting sides of primate social life. First, primates live in a cutthroat world, which forces a male to conceal physical impairment for as long as possible in order to keep up a tough facade. But second, they are part of a tight community in which they count on affection and assistance from others, including non-relatives. Such dualities are hard to grasp. Popular writers prefer to simplify things by describing the lives of chimpanzees either in Hobbesian terms, as nasty and brutish, or by stressing their friendly side. But in fact, it's never one or the other. It's always both. If people ask how chimpanzees can possibly be called empathic, knowing that they sometimes kill one another, my return question is always whether by the same token we shouldn't abandon the whole notion of human empathy as well. This duality is crucial. Morality would be superfluous if we were universally nice. What would there be to worry about if all that humans ever did was show sympathy for one another, and never steal, never stab someone in the back, never covet another's wife? This is clearly not how we are, and it explains the need for moral rules. On the other hand, we could design a zillion rules to promote respect and care for others, but they'd come to naught if we didn't already lean in that direction. They would be like seeds dropped onto a glass plate, without a chance of taking root. What permits us to tell right from wrong is our ability to be both good and bad. Daisy's assistance to Amos officially ranks as altruism, defined as behavior that costs you something, such as taking a risk or expending energy while it benefits another. Most biological discussions of altruism don't concern themselves much with motives, however, only with how such behavior affects others and why evolution might have produced it. Even though this debate is over 150 years old, it took center stage in the past few decades. The gene's point of view. Secure your own oxygen mask before assisting anyone else, we are urged at the beginning of every flight. Altruism requires that we take care of ourselves first, which is exactly what one of the chief theoreticians of this field tragically failed to do, as is described by the Israeli science historian Oren Harman in his enthralling book, The Price of Altruism. George Price was an eccentric American chemist who moved to London in 1967, where he became a population geneticist trying to solve the mystery of altruism with brilliant mathematical formulas. He had trouble solving his own problems, though. He had shown little sensitivity to others in his previous life. He abandoned his wife and daughters and was a lousy son to his aging mother. And the pendulum now swung to the other extreme. From a staunch skeptic and atheist, he turned into a devout Christian who dedicated his life to the city's vagabonds. He gave up all of his possessions while neglecting himself. By the age of 50, He was sinewy and gaunt like an old man, with rotting teeth and a raspy voice. In 1975, Price ended his life with a pair of scissors. Following a long-standing tradition, Price loved to pit altruism against selfishness. The sharper the contrast, the deeper the riddle of where altruism might have come from. There is, of course, no shortage of such puzzles. Defending their hive, honeybees die shortly after having stung intruders. Chimpanzees rescue each other from leopard attacks. Squirrels give alarm calls that warn others of danger. Elephants try to lift up fallen comrades. But why would any animal act on behalf of another? Isn't this against the laws of nature? Scientists passionately worked on, debated, and bickered about a theoretical problem that outsiders find esoteric, but that lies at the core of recent progress in behavioral biology and evolutionary psychology. Apart from the drama of Price's life and death, there was no lack of momentous events and personal encounters, such as the sublime irony that John Maynard Smith, a famous British evolutionary biologist, brought the even more famous J.B.S. Haldane on his deathbed a book that claimed that birds prevent overpopulation by curtailing their own reproduction. For a biologist, this would count as altruism, since it would permit others to reproduce at a cost to oneself. This whole idea received heaps of ridicule in years to follow, however, given how unlikely it is that animals put the greater good before their own. Haldane immediately saw the problem, telling his visitors with a mischievous smile, "Well, there are these blackcock, you see, and the males are all strutting around, and every so often a female comes along, and one of them mates with her. And they've got this stick, and every time they mate with a female, they cut a little notch in it. And when they've cut 12 notches, if another female comes along, they say, 'Now, ladies, enough is enough.'" Popularizers often stress how traits help the survival of the species or the group, yet most biologists, including myself, recoil from evolutionary scenarios that stress the group level. This is because most groups don't act like genetic units. In the primates, for example, virtually all members of a given sex, males in most monkeys, but females in apes, leave their group at puberty to join the neighbors, just as humans frequently intermarry between tribes. This seriously blurs the kinship lines. Primate groups are too genetically leaky for natural selection to get a grip on them. The only units that may qualify are those based on shared genes, such as extended families. Haldane was one of the main architects of the gene's eye view of evolution. Looked at from the standpoint of the genes, altruism gets a special meaning. Even if one loses one's own life to save a relative, one still perpetuates genes that one has in common with this relative. Helping kin is therefore like helping oneself. Stooped drunk over a beer, Haldane is said to have slurred, "I'll jump into a river for 2 brothers and 8 cousins," thus foreshadowing the theory of kin selection proposed by William Hamilton, one of the brightest and nicest biologists since Charles Darwin. I add nicest to contrast Hamilton with the scientist who in fact coined the term kin selection in an article that ran off with Hamilton's idea without offering him credit. This was the same Maynard Smith mentioned before, who upon hearing of Hamilton's idea is said to have exclaimed, "Of course! Why didn't I think of that?" Ever since Hamilton found out which anonymous reviewer on his seminal paper had delayed its publication, he harbored a burning grudge against Maynard Smith, despite the many apologies he received. Price almost suffered the same fate when Maynard Smith merely wanted to thank him for his ideas on restrained combat. Why don't venomous snakes use their deadly fangs on each other, But fortunately, Price managed to gain co-authorship instead. Initially, kin selection overshadowed every discussion of altruism, owing to a focus on social insects, such as bees and termites, which live in colonies of close relatives. But a second explanation gained equal prominence. Robert Trivers, an American evolutionary biologist, proposed that cooperation among non-relatives often relies on reciprocal altruism. Helpful acts that are costly in the short run nevertheless produce long-term benefits if favors are being returned. If I rescue a friend who almost drowns, and he rescues me under similar circumstances, both of us will be better off than we would have been on our own. Reciprocal altruism allows cooperative networks to expand beyond kinship ties. Not surprisingly, most players in this long quest were politically opinionated. One of them, the British statistician and biologist Ronald Fisher, was an avowed eugenicist, who felt that the human race could use some genetic improvement. Another one, the Hungarian-American game theoretician John von Neumann, was so enthralled by his own calculations that he urged the U.S. Senate in 1955 to drop the atomic bomb onto the Soviets, saying, "If you say, why not bomb them tomorrow, I say, why not today?" Others were card-carrying communists, however, and early on there was, of course, Peter Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist prince. Despite the charge by opponents that evolutionary biology is a right-wing plot, the altruism debate took place mostly on the left rather than right side of the ideological spectrum. I know this firsthand. Since Trivers and the late Hamilton occasionally met in California at meetings of the Grutter Institute for Law and Behavioral Research, of which I have been part for decades. I once conducted an interview with Bob to ask him about the implications of his theory. Here is one of his answers. Franz de Waal. Reading between the lines, I recognize in your paper the same sort of social commitment that led Kropotkin to develop his ideas. Trivers. You're right about my political preferences. When I left mathematics and cast about what I was going to do in college, I said, self-ironic bombast, "All right, I'll become a lawyer and fight for civil rights and against poverty." Someone suggested that I take up U.S. history, but you know, at that time, in the early 1960s, their books were entirely self-congratulatory. I ended up in biology. Because I remained a political liberal, for me, emotionally, to see that just pursuing this scratch-my-back argument would generate rather quickly a reason for justice and fairness was very gratifying, because it was on the other side of the fence of that awful tradition in biology of the right of the strongest. After having attended Price's funeral, Hamilton went to rescue the dead scientist's papers in a squatter's flat, commenting how much kinship he felt with the man who by the end of his life was talking to God. I try to be in everything a slave of the Lord, and bring large and small matters to Him for decision. One explanation of Price's untimely death is that he was deeply upset by the unpleasant implications of his own calculations, such as the impossibility to evolve loyalty to the in-group without also evolving torture, rape, and murder of the out-group. He despaired at the thought that altruism might not have come into existence without its negative flip side. But Price also harbored the idea that self-interest stands in the way of genuine altruism. This giant misunderstanding may have cost him his life as he probed the boundaries of human nature by testing his own capacity for self-sacrifice. Never mind that most human altruism doesn't operate this way. It grows out of empathy with those in need, and the whole point of empathy is a blurring of the line between self and other. This obviously makes the difference between selfish and unselfish motives rather hazy. Realizing that empathy needs to be part of any theory of human altruism, Trivers tested the concept on Hamilton. Long ago I spoke to Bill about it. I said, "What about empathy, Bill?" And he said, "What's empathy?" As if it didn't exist, as if there was no such thing. Too bad, I should add, because attention to the way altruism works might have reduced the amount of controversy and confusion about what genes are capable of. The road between genes and behavior is far from straight, and the psychology that produces altruism deserves as much attention as the genes themselves. The error of early theorizing was to skip these complexities. Empathy is mostly a mammalian trait, so the deeper error was that great thinkers had lumped all sorts of altruism together. There are the bees dying for their hive, and the millions of slime mold cells that build a single slug-like organism that permits a few among them to reproduce. This kind of sacrifice was put on the same level as the man jumping into an icy river to rescue a stranger, or the chimpanzee sharing food with a whining orphan. From an evolutionary perspective, both kinds of helping are comparable, but psychologically speaking, they are radically different. Do slime molds even have motivations the way we do? And when bees sting an intruder, aren't they driven by aggression, rather than by the benign motives we associate with altruism? Mammals have what I call an altruistic impulse, in that they respond to signs of distress in others and feel an urge to improve their situation. To recognize the need of others and react appropriately is really not the same as a pre-programmed tendency to sacrifice oneself for the genetic good. With the increasing popularity of the gene's eye view, however, these distinctions were overlooked. This led to a cynical outlook on human and animal nature. The altruistic impulse was downplayed, ridiculed even, and morality was taken off the table entirely. We were only slightly better than social insects. Human kindness was seen as a charade, and morality as a thin veneer over a cauldron of nasty tendencies. This outlook, which I have dubbed veneer theory, can be traced back to Thomas Henry Huxley, also known as Darwin's bulldog. The bulldog's cul-de-sac. Darwin being defended by Huxley is a bit like Albert Einstein being defended by me. For the life of me, I can't grasp the theory of relativity. I'm just not mathematically inclined enough, even though I can follow the speeding train example and other simplifications for dummies. All that Einstein could possibly expect from me is an arm-waving story about how I think he had a great idea that superseded Isaac Newton's mechanistic notions. Not much help, of course, but not unlike what happened to Darwin when Huxley took up his cause. Huxley lacked formal education and was a self-taught comparative anatomist of great standing. He was notoriously reluctant, however, to accept natural selection as the chief engine of evolution, and also had trouble with gradualism. These are no minor details, which is why we shouldn't be surprised that one of the last century's leading biologists, Ernst Mayr, harshly concluded that Huxley did not represent genuine Darwinian thought in any way. Huxley is best known for wiping the floor with Bishop Soapy Sam Wilberforce in an 1860 public debate about evolution, in which the bishop mockingly inquired whether Huxley descended from the primates through his grandfather's or his grandmother's side. Huxley is said to have replied that he wouldn't mind to be the progeny of an ape, but would be quite ashamed to be connected to someone who abuses his oratorical gifts to obscure the truth. It is good to take this famous story with a grain of salt, though. Apart from the fact that it was concocted decades after the encounter, there's the problem that Huxley's voice was too weak to command an audience. In the days before microphones, this mattered. One of the other scientists present wrote dismissively that Huxley was unable to throw his voice over so large an assembly, and that it was he, the botanist Joseph Hooker, who had confronted the bishop. I smashed him amid rounds of applause. I hit him in the wind at the first shot and 10 words taken from his own ugly mouth. The bishop himself, by the way, felt that he had thoroughly taken care of his opponents. This must have been one of those rare debates where everyone was a winner. It was Huxley, however, who went down in history as the great defender of science against religion. Being a far more retiring person, Darwin needed a soldier by his side to make the case for his controversial ideas. Huxley loved to fight and had been looking for a cause to sink his teeth into. After having read The Origin of Species, he eagerly offered Darwin his services. I am sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness. Contributing to Huxley's reputation as the slayer of religion is his invention of the term agnostic, meaning that he wasn't sure of God's existence. He saw agnosticism as a method, however, not a creed. He advocated scientific arguments that were based purely on evidence, rather than on any higher authority, a position nowadays known as rationalist. Huxley deserves admiration for this major step in the right direction, but the great irony is that he remained deeply religious and allowed this to color his outlook. He described himself as a scientific Calvinist, and much of his thinking followed the somber, joyless precepts of the doctrine of original sin. Given that pain in the world is a certainty, he said, we can only hope to endure it with clenched teeth, his grin-and-bear-it philosophy. Nature lacks the capacity of producing any good, or in Huxley's own words, the doctrines of predestination, of original sin, of the innate depravity of man and the evil fate of the greater part of the race, of the primacy of Satan in this world, of the essential vileness of matter, of a malevolent demiurgus subordinate to a benevolent Almighty, who has only lately revealed himself, faulty as they are, appear to me to be vastly nearer the truth than the liberal popular illusions that babies are all born good. The primacy of Satan? Does this sound like an agnostic? A book entitled Lay Sermons allowed Huxley to compete with sermons from the pulpit. He adopted such a preachy tone that his critics called him self-righteous and full of puritanical convictions. Huxley's religious attitudes, hidden underneath a desire for objective truth, explain why he developed the near theory and its bleak assessment of human nature. He saw human ethics as a victory over nature, similar to a well-tended garden. The gardener struggles every day to keep his garden from going wild. As Huxley put it, the horticultural process is opposed to the cosmic process. Nature tries to undermine the gardener's efforts by invading his plot with despised weeds, slugs, and other pests ready to choke off the exotic plants he wants to cultivate. The metaphor says it all. Ethics is a uniquely human answer to an unruly, wicked evolutionary process. In his well-known lecture on this topic for a large audience in Oxford in 1893, Huxley summed up his position. The practice of that which is ethically best, what we call goodness or virtue, involves a course of conduct which in all respects is opposed to that which leads to success in the cosmic struggle for existence. Unfortunately, the anatomist gave no hint where humanity might have unearthed the will and strength to defeat its own nature. If we are indeed devoid of natural benevolence, how and why did we decide to become model citizens? And if doing so was to our advantage, as one would hope, why did nature refuse us a helping hand? Why must we perpetually sweat in the garden to keep our immoral impulses at bay? It is a bizarre theory, if that's what we call it, according to which morality is only an evolutionary afterthought, barely capable of concealing the sinners we truly are. Note that this dark idea was entirely Huxley's. I agree with Meyer that it doesn't bear the slightest resemblance to Darwin's thinking. In the words of Huxley's biographer, he was forcing his ethical arc against the Darwinian current which had brought him so far. In the end, Darwin desperately needed a defender against his public defender. He got one in the form of Kropotkin, a first-rate naturalist. Whereas Huxley was a city boy with little first-hand knowledge of non-cadaverous animals, Kropotkin had traveled around Siberia and noticed how rarely animal encounters fit the gladiatorial style hyped by Huxley, who imagined a continuous free fight. Kropotkin had noticed frequent cooperation between members of the same species. Huddling together in the cold or collectively standing up to predators such as wild horses against wolves was critical for survival. Kropotkin emphasized these themes in his 1902 book Mutual Aid, which was explicitly directed against infidels such as Huxley, who misinterpreted Darwin. True, Kropotkin went overboard in the other direction, cherry-picking examples of animal solidarity to support his political views, yet he was right to protest Huxley's depiction of nature, which was poorly informed by reality. For me, the biggest question of all is how to exit from the Huxleyan cul-de-sac. If we are not allowed to talk about God, and if evolution offers no answer either, what could possibly explain human morality? With both religion and biology out of the picture, all I see is a big black hole. And the most astonishing of all is that biologists, like bad drivers, steered us into the same blind alley again, a century later. My life as a toilet frog. In Australia, it's not unusual to find a sizable frog in your toilet bowl. You may try to move it out, but the frog will happily hop back into the bowl, where it attaches itself with its suction cup toes during the occasional tsunamis that we humans produce. These frogs don't seem to mind the body waste swirling down the bowl, but I do. I felt like a toilet frog during the last 3 decades of the preceding century. I had to hang on desperately each time a book came out on the human condition, whether written by biologists, anthropologists, or science journalists, because most of them advocated ideas totally anathema to the way I view our species. One can consider humans as either inherently good but capable of evil, or as inherently evil yet capable of good. I happen to belong to the first camp. But the literature stressed only the negative side. Even positive traits had to be phrased as if they were problematic. Animals and humans love their families? Let's call it nepotism. Chimpanzees permit friends to eat food out of their hands. Let's call it pilfering and scrounging. The prevailing tone was full of misgivings about kindness. Here is a characteristic statement cited over and over in this literature. No hint of genuine charity ameliorates our vision of society once sentimentalism has been laid aside. What passes for cooperation turns out to be a mixture of opportunism and exploitation. Given a full chance to act in his own interest, nothing but expediency will restrain a person from brutalizing, from maiming, from murdering his brother, his mate, his parent, or his child. Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed. Altruists are just hypocrites for Michael Gesellen, an American biologist so well known for his work on the sea slug that one of its defensive chemicals, Gesellinin, was named after him. But instead of dealing with slugs, the aforementioned statement was about humans. It set the tone for much that followed, as was also reflected 2 decades later in The Moral Animal by the science journalist Robert Wright. The pretense of selflessness is about as much part of human nature as is its frequent absence. And then there is George Williams, the American evolutionary biologist, who took perhaps the most extreme position. Offering a dark assessment of nature's wretchedness, he felt that calling nature amoral or morally indifferent, as Huxley wisely had done, didn't go far enough. He rather accused nature of gross immorality, thus becoming the first, and hopefully last biologist, to infuse the evolutionary process with moral agency. The argument typically ran as follows. 1. Natural selection is a selfish, nasty process. 2. This automatically produces selfish and nasty individuals. And 3. Only romantics with flowers in their hair would think otherwise. Obviously, Darwin was claimed to be on board with the expulsion of morality from the natural domain, as if Darwin would ever have let himself get stuck in Huxley's cul-de-sac. Darwin was too smart for this, as I will explain, which is why the height of absurdity was reached when Richard Dawkins explicitly disavowed Darwin, telling an interviewer in 1997 that in our political and social life we are entitled to throw out Darwinism. I declined to cite more smelly stuff. The only scientist to reach a perfectly logical conclusion, even if I fully disagree, was Francis Collins, head of America's largest federal research agency, the National Institutes of Health. Having read all those books that doubt the evolution of morality and observing that humanity nevertheless possesses a measure of it, Collins saw no way around a supernatural source. The moral law stands out for me as the strongest signpost of God. Naturally, the esteemed geneticist became the laughingstock of the nascent atheist movement. Some claimed he was polluting science with faith, while Dawkins, with characteristic lenience, called him not a bright guy. Never mind the deeper problem, which is that by seriously fumbling the morality question, biologists have left the door wide open for alternative accounts. The whole episode could have been avoided had Collins encountered a more thoughtful evolutionary literature, one taking its lead from Darwin's The Descent of Man. Reading this book, one realizes that there is absolutely no need to throw the old men under the bus. Darwin had no trouble aligning morality with the evolutionary process and recognizing the human capacity for good. Most interesting for me, he saw emotional continuity with other animals. For Huxley, animals were mindless automata, but Darwin wrote an entire book about their emotions, including their capacity for sympathy. One memorable example was how a particular dog would never walk by a basket where a sick friend lay, a cat, without giving her a few licks. Darwin saw this as a sure sign of affection. In his last note to Huxley right before his death, Darwin couldn't resist gently poking fun at his friend's Cartesian bent, hinting that if animals are machines, then humans must be too. I wish to God there were more automata in the world like you. Darwin's writing massively contradicts veneer theory. He speculated, for example, that morality grew straight out of animal social instincts, saying that it would be absurd to speak of these instincts as having been developed from selfishness. Darwin saw the potential for genuine altruism, at least at the psychological level. Like most biologists, he drew a sharp line between the process of natural selection, which indeed has nothing nice about it, and its many products, which cover a wide range of tendencies. He disagreed that a nasty process ipso facto is life evaluating Ludwig van Beethoven's music on the basis of how and where it was composed. The maestro's Viennese apartment was a messy, smelly pigsty strewn with waste and unemptied chamber pots. Of course, no one judges Beethoven's music by it. In the same way, even if genetic evolution proceeds through death and destruction, this doesn't taint the marvels it has produced. That seems an obvious point to make, but once I had done so at length in my 1996 book, Good-Natured, I grew tired of the battle against veneer theory. For 3 long decades, it was greeted with, irrational exuberance, no doubt owing to its simplicity. Everyone understood it. Everyone loved it. How could I disagree with something so obvious? But then a curious thing happened. The theory vaporized. Rather than dying from a slow, feverish illness, veneer theory suffered a massive heart attack. I don't quite understand how and why this happened. Perhaps it was Y2K, but by the end of the 20th century, the need to combat Darwin's infidels had quickly evaporated. New data were coming in, first as a trickle, then as a steady stream. Data have this wonderful quality of burying theories. I remember picking up an article in 2001 entitled The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. It was by Jonathan Haidt, an American psychologist, who argued that we arrive at moral decisions through intuitive processes. We hardly think about them. Haidt presented subjects with stories of odd behavior, such as a one-night stand between a brother and sister, which they immediately disapproved of. He then challenged every single reason his subjects could come up with until they ran out of arguments. They might say that incest leads to abnormal offspring, but in Haidt's story the siblings used effective contraception, which took care of this problem. Most of his subjects quickly reached the stage of moral dumbfounding. They stubbornly insisted the behavior was wrong without being able to explain why. Haidt concluded that moral decisions come from the gut. Our emotions decide, after which human reason does its best to catch up. With this dent in the primacy of logic, Hume's moral sentiments made a comeback. Anthropologists demonstrated a sense of fairness in people across the world. Economists found humans to be more cooperative and altruistic than the Homo economicus view would allow. Experiments with children and primates found altruism in the absence of incentives. 6-month-old babies were said to know the difference between naughty and nice, and neuroscientists found our brains to be hardwired to feel the pain of others. We had come full circle by 2011, when humans were officially declared super cooperators. Every new development slammed another nail in the coffin of veneer theory until the common view had swiveled around 180 degrees. It is now widely assumed that we are designed in body and mind to live together and take care of each other, and that humans have a natural tendency to judge others in moral terms. Instead of being a thin veneer, morality comes from within. It's part of our biology, a view supported by the many parallels found in other animals. In a few decades, we had gone from calls to teach our children to be nice, since our species lacks any and all natural inclinations in this direction, to the consensus that we are born to be good and that nice guys finish first. How radically attitudes have changed is clear every time I show audiences the notorious Gesellen statement that had landed me in the toilet to begin with. Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed. Although I've featured this cynical line for decades in my lectures, it is only since about 2005 that audiences greet it with audible gasps and guffaws as something so outrageous, so out of touch with how they see themselves, that they can't believe it was ever taken seriously. Had the author never had a friend, a loving wife, or a dog for that matter, what a sad life he must have lived. Seeing the shocked reaction and how widespread it has become, I'm left wondering whether my audiences have changed under the influence of new evidence, or whether it's perhaps the other way around. Have we entered a new zeitgeist? And is science simply catching up? Regardless, it has left my toilet smelling like a rose. Finally, I can release my grip, stretch my legs, and swim around. Full of mistakes. But still, it could all be a colossal mistake. Kindness could be maladaptive, occurring at the wrong time and wrong place. Take the way Daisy cared for a dying Amos, or how humans nurse the terminally ill. What is the point? Many people take care of an aging spouse, as my mother did during my father's last years. What a load she carried, she being so much smaller and he barely able to walk. Or think of caring for a husband or wife with Alzheimer's, who needs supervision every minute of the day, doesn't appreciate your efforts, and reacts surprised every time you enter the room, complaining that you've abandoned him or her. Stress and exhaustion are all you will ever get out of it. In none of these cases is there much chance of repayment, whereas evolutionary theory insists that altruism should benefit either blood relatives or those willing and able to return the favor. A dying spouse doesn't fit the bill. Since Daisy, my mother, and millions of caretakers deviate from evolutionary dogma, there has been much talk of misfiring genes that cause us to be better than is good for us. Don't be misled by this kind of rhetoric, though. The reason why misfiring genes don't exist as a concept in genetics is that genes are just little chunks of DNA that know nothing and intend nothing. They have the effect that they have without any goal in mind, hence are incapable of mistakes. It would be more appropriate to call rampant altruism a glorious accident, but few experts are in a celebratory mood. Their message is rather sour, as if a great theory about the selfish origins of altruism is regrettably spoiled by the facts. They complain that almost everything in modern life is a mistake from the gene's point of view, but never conclude that this makes their theories largely irrelevant. There's the mistake of sending money to faraway places struck by a tsunami or an earthquake. Anonymously donating blood is a mistake. Working in a soup kitchen or shoveling snow for an old lady is a mistake, as is pouring all of our resources into an adopted child. The latter is an incomprehensible multi-year mistake made by thousands of families ignorant of the fact that children who don't share their genes lack any value. Families do the same with pets, providing extraordinary care for animals that lack repayment options. Other common mistakes are warning a stranger of danger, pointing out that someone has left his coat in a restaurant, and picking up a stranded driver. Human life is chock full of mistakes, large and small. The same applies to the lives of other primates. Take Phineas, Amos's father. Not that Amos knew that Phineas was his father. In chimpanzee society, there are no permanent bonds between males and females, so that, in principle, any male might be your father. Phineas had been alpha in earlier years, but when he turned 40, he began to take it easy. He loved to play with juveniles, groom with females, and act as policeman. As soon as he heard a squabble, Phineas would go over to make a big show of force, with all his hair on end, to break it up. He would stand between the contestants until the screaming stopped. This control role is also well documented for wild chimpanzees. Remarkably, males in this role don't take sides. They defend the weaker party, even if the attacker is their best buddy. I have often puzzled over their impartiality, which deviates from so much else that chimpanzees do. By transcending the performer's social biases, the control role truly aims at what's best for the community. Jessica Flack and I demonstrated how much the group benefits from such behavior by temporarily removing males that act as arbiters. The result was a society coming apart at its seams. Aggression increased and reconciliation decreased. Order was restored, however, as soon as we returned the males to their group. This still leaves the question, however, why they do it. What is in it for them? The main idea is that high-ranking males gain respect and popularity by coming up for the underdog. But while this may be a perfectly good strategy for younger males, I have trouble applying it to Phineas. Toward the end of his life, this gentle old guy was clearly over the hill and seemed to have a few ambitions left. Yet, he zealously monitored discord in the group. His push for harmony was to everyone's advantage except perhaps his own. Are chimpanzees, too, more generous than they should be, according to gene-centric theories? It is quite common for chimps to help unrelated individuals, such as when Washoe, the world's first chimpanzee trained in American Sign Language, heard a female she barely knew scream and hit the water. Racing across 2 electric fences to reach the victim, Washoe dragged her to safety. Another case concerned Tia, a wild female at Fongoli in Senegal, who had lost her infant to poachers. Fortunately, researchers managed to confiscate the baby ape to return it to the group. Jill Pruitt described how Mike, an unrelated adolescent male, who was too young to be the infant's father, picked it up from where the scientists had left it and carried it straight to Tia. He obviously knew to whom the baby belonged and probably also had noticed how much trouble Tia had in moving around after having been mauled by the poacher's dogs. For 2 days, Mike carried the baby during group travel while Tia limped behind. Even the costliest investment of all, the adoption of unrelated young, is not unknown. Not just in females, where one might expect it, but a recent report by Christophe Bosch from Ivory Coast lists at least 10 wild male chimps who, over a period of 3 decades, adopted juveniles who had lost their mothers. In 2012, Disney Nature released its popular movie Chimpanzee, which captured how Freddie, the community's alpha male, took Oscar under his wing. This documentary was based on real events. When Oscar's mother suddenly died of natural causes, the camera crew happened to be at the right place at the right time. It stayed around even though the prospects for little Oscar looked bleak. Freddie followed the pattern of other adoptive males, who shared food with youngsters, allowed them to sleep in their night nests, protected them against danger, and diligently searched for them when lost. Some cared for their charges for over 1 year, and one male did so for over 5 years. Chimpanzees don't reach adulthood until they are at least 12. Barring nursing, these stepfathers were taking on the same burden as mothers do for their offspring, strongly enhancing the orphan's chances at survival. According to DNA samples, adoptive males are not necessarily related to their charges. Oscar was lucky. Rather than concluding that chimps too make mistakes, let's move away from such normative language and its implication that we are born to obey our genes. Why not simply recognize the disconnect between the origin of a trait and its current use? Tree frogs evolved suction cups to cling to leaves, yet may use them to survive in a toilet. Primate hands evolved to grasp tree branches, but I play the piano with them, and baby monkeys use them to cling to their mothers. Many traits evolve for one reason, yet have come to serve others as well. I have never heard anyone call fingers gliding over a piano a mistake. So why apply this sort of language to altruism? One might counter that altruism has a cost, whereas piano playing does not, and that this justifies the mistake terminology. But how sure are we that generalized empathy and lifelong commitments don't pay off in the long run? I have never seen proof that such behavior harms us, and rather suspect the opposite. Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously gave us the God is dead phrase, was interested in the sources of morality. He warned that the emergence of something, whether an organ, a legal institution, or a religious ritual, is never to be confused with its acquired purposes. Anything in existence having somehow come about is continually interpreted anew, requisitioned anew, transformed and redirected to a new purpose. This is a liberating thought, which teaches us to never hold the history of something against its possible applications. Even if computers started out as calculators, that doesn't prevent us from playing games on them. Even if sex evolved for reproduction, anyone is free, up to a point, to engage in it for fun. There is no law that says traits need each and every time to serve the purpose for which they evolved. The same applies to empathy and altruism, which is why we should simply replace the word mistake with potential. Nothing keeps me from empathizing with a stranded whale and joining efforts to haul it back to the ocean, even if human empathy didn't come into existence with whales in mind. I'm just applying my innate empathic capacity to its fullest potential. Nietzsche was right. An item's history has limited relevance in the here and now. While I stand in awe before the insights provided by Price, Hamilton, Trivers, and others into the evolutionary background of altruism, I see no reason to turn these insights into a dogma about how humans ought to behave. Hedonic kindness. Science tells us that we breathe in order to supplement our bodies with oxygen. Lacking this knowledge, however, I'd still do exactly the same, like millions of humans before me and billions of animals. Awareness of O2 is not what drives breathing. Similarly, when biologists speculate that altruism evolved for its payoffs, it doesn't mean that actors need to know about this. Most animals don't think ahead, as in, if I do this for him, he may return the favor tomorrow. Lacking foresight, they just follow a benevolent impulse. The same applies to humans. Except in business or between unacquainted people, humans rarely tally up the costs and benefits of their behavior, especially among friends and family. In fact, doing so is a bad sign, which family therapists use as an indicator that a marriage is on the rocks. Both human and animal altruism may be genuine, therefore, in that it lacks ulterior motives. This is true to the point that we have trouble suppressing it. James Rilling, an Emory colleague of mine, concluded from neuroimaging experiments that we have emotional biases toward cooperation that can only be overcome with effortful cognitive control. Think about it. This means that our first impulse is to trust and assist. Only secondarily do we weigh the option of not doing so, for which we need reasons. This is the exact opposite of being driven by incentives. Only one category of people lacks this natural impulse, which explains my usual quip that veneer theory perfectly captures the psychopathic mindset. Rilling further showed that when normal people aid others, brain areas associated with reward are activated. Doing good feels good. This warm glow effect brings a touching image to mind that I have seen countless times while working with rhesus monkeys. The behavior in question was not exactly altruistic, but very close to the source of all mammalian nurturance. Every spring our zoo troops produced dozens of newborns. The babies held magnetic appeal for juvenile females who would try to get their little hands on them by patiently grooming their mothers. It would take a long time of hanging around the mother until the baby would be released to take a few wobbly steps toward the would-be sitter. She'd pick it up, carry it around, turn it upside down to inspect its genitals, lick its face, groom it from all sides, but eventually doze off with the baby firmly clutched in her arms. We took bets on how long it would take. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The sleepiness that overcame the babysitters gave the impression that they were in a trance, or perhaps ecstatic, having waited so long for their lucky break. As they held their treasure, release of oxytocin in their bloodstream and brains, known as the hormone of love, weighed down their eyelids. Their sleep would never last long, though, and soon they'd return the baby to its mother. The joy of baby care prepares young females for the most altruistic act of all. Mammalian maternal care is the costliest, longest-lasting investment in other beings known in nature, starting with nourishment of the fetus and ending many years later. Or, as most parents would say, never. Strangely enough, however, maternal care has been largely absent from the altruism debate. Some scientists don't even want to count it as altruism, since it doesn't fit their emphasis on sacrifice. They want to speak of altruism only if it harms the performer, at least in the short run. No one should be eager to be an altruist, let alone take pleasure in it. I call this the altruism hurts hypothesis, which is deeply erroneous. After all, the definition of altruism is not that it needs to cause pain, only that it carries a cost. Mind you, biologists have absolutely no trouble explaining why a female mammal would care for her offspring. How else is she going to propagate? We also know how much women want babies. I don't want to be grisly about it, but the desire is strong enough that some women kill for it and cut open another's belly, or they steal babies from the nursery. These are sick cases, yet illustrate the overwhelming desire and the reason why baby care isn't regarded as a sacrifice. With maternal care not being much of a puzzle, science has focused on more perplexing behavior. Science seeks challenges, yet I would still argue that at least for mammals, maternal care is the prototypical form of altruism, the template for all the rest. We ignore it at our peril. It is telling that not a single woman scientist that I know of has gotten carried away by the question of where altruism comes from. For women, maternal care would be hard to leave out, as has been illustrated by two women who did write on human cooperation. Sarah Hrdy, an American anthropologist, proposes an "it takes a village" theory, according to which the human team spirit started with collective care for the young, not just by mothers, but by all adults around. Similarly, Patricia Churchland, an American philosopher well-versed in neuroscience, treats human morality as an outgrowth of caring tendencies. The neurocircuitry that regulate the organism's own bodily functions has been co-opted to include the needs of the young, treating them almost like extra limbs. Our children are part of us, so we protect and nurse them unthinkingly the way we do our bodies. The same brain mechanism provides the basis for other caring relations. This would explain observable sex differences, which start early in life. At birth, girl babies look longer at faces than do boy babies, which look longer at mechanical toys. Later in life, girls are more prosocial than boys, better readers of emotional expressions, more attuned to voices, more remorseful after having hurt someone, and better at taking someone else's perspective. We also have learned that empathy is enhanced by oxytocin, sprayed into the nostrils of both men and women, thus fooling them with the maternal hormone par excellence. Oxytocin is associated with childbirth and nursing. In our own studies, we have found that female chimpanzees console distressed parties more often than males do. They approach victims of aggression, tenderly put an arm around them, and hug them until the screaming stops. Females are the more nurturing sex. If maternal care was almost too obvious for theoreticians to consider, it is almost the most self-rewarding care, which brings me to the altruism feels-good hypothesis. Invariably, nature associates things that we need to do with pleasure. Since we need to eat, the smell of food makes us drool like Pavlov's dogs, and food consumption is a favorite activity. We need to reproduce, so sex is both an obsession and a joy. And to make sure we raise our young, nature gave us attachments, none of which exceeds that between mother and offspring. Like any other mammal, we are totally pre-programmed for this in body and mind. As a result, we barely notice the daily efforts on behalf of our progeny and choke about the arm and leg that it costs. Distant relatives and non-relatives obviously recruit less help, but the underlying satisfaction remains the same, an insight already present in the meditations of the 2nd century Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius. Acts that are consistent with nature like helping others, are their own reward. We are group animals who rely on each other, need each other, and therefore take pleasure in helping and sharing. In the 1996 movie Marvin's Room, Bessie, played by Diane Keaton, is visited by her more worldly sister Meryl Streep. Bessie devoted many years of her life caring for their father, never getting any help from her sister. When Bessie tells her sister that she feels she has been lucky to have had her parents, having so much love in her life, her sister misunderstands, in her own self-centered way, what she means, and tells her, "They love you very much." Bessie corrects her, saying, "That's not what I mean, no. I mean that I have been so lucky to be able to love someone so much." Altruism can fill us with happiness. The odd notion that altruism has to hurt drove George Price to try his hand at extreme self-sacrifice. One can't be a great altruist without suffering, he thought, and so he gave up all of his possessions and neglected himself to the point that he became miserable. He didn't realize that self-neglect is counterproductive, a theme well known to charity workers. As with the oxygen masks on airplanes, the self needs to be fed before it can take care of anyone else. I have often thought about where the odd altruism hurts notion may have come from. It's totally anathema, for example, to Buddhism, in which compassion for others is supposed to fill us with joy. This effect isn't limited to self-reflecting adults, but occurs also in toddlers, who derive greater satisfaction from giving treats to others than from receiving them. There is also intriguing evidence from a study of people taking care of a sick spouse or parent. The psychologist Stephanie Brown found that caregivers barely notice the cost of their behavior. They feel at one with their charges and derive such great fulfillment from being needed that they live longer than individuals without a need to take care of others. On the basis of my personal experience taking care of my wife, whose life was imperiled by breast cancer, I totally agree that the word sacrifice, although often applied, misses the point. Nothing comes more naturally to us than taking care of loved ones. Churchland correctly saw continuity between caring for one's own body, caring for one's children, and caring for those close to us. Our brain has been designed to blur the line between self and other. It is an ancient neurocircuitry that marks every mammal, from mouse to elephant. In a Thai nature reserve, I encountered a blind elephant walking around with her seeing eye friend. The two unrelated females appeared joined at the hip. The blind one depended on the other, who seemed to understand this. As soon as the latter moved away, one could hear deep, rumbling sounds coming from both of them, sometimes even trumpeting, which indicated the other's whereabouts to the blind elephant. The noisy spectacle would continue until they were reunited again. An intensive greeting followed, with lots of ear-flapping, touching, and mutual smelling. They enjoyed a close relationship, which enabled the blind female to lead a reasonably normal elephant life. Given its intrinsic rewards, some like to label care for family and close associates selfish, at least at an emotional level. While not incorrect, this obviously undermines the whole distinction between selfishness and altruism. If my eating all the food on the table is just as selfish as my sharing it with a hungry stranger, language has become obsolete. How can a single concept cover such divergent motivations? More importantly, why is my satisfaction at seeing the stranger eat confused with my being selfish? Why can't altruism be like any other natural human tendency in that it yields pleasure? Many people love to spoil their family and friends, and the greatest joy we can give them is to just let them do it. Looking back on how we got to this reversal of perspectives from altruism as a sacrifice that is hard to explain to the modern notion of altruism as rooted in mammalian nurturance, endowed with intrinsic rewards, I'm struck by how many ideological and religious elements infuse the debate ranging from Price's conversion to Christianity, Huxley's preoccupation with original sin, Kropotkin's anarchism, and the curiously popular notion of altruism as either hypocritical or mistaken. Missing from most of this debate has been the view that humans and other mammals achieve altruism quite differently than, say, the social insects. Perhaps it is the common comparison of human altruism with that of ants and bees that has thrown us off. Insects lack empathy, whereas our brains are built to connect with others and experience their pain and pleasure. The end result is that altruism can be both genuine and satisfying at the same time. If Price pushed himself beyond this boundary by giving up his health and wealth for fellow vagabonds whom he barely knew, his eventual despair is understandable. He underestimated the hedonic quality of altruism aimed at those we care about, and overestimated our capacity for generosity toward strangers. The second is seriously limited, whereas the first knows few bounds. Chapter 3. Bonobos in the Family Tree. The best way to destroy an enemy is to make him a friend. Abraham Lincoln. Our visit to a forensic laboratory in Moscow confirmed my suspicion that being a close relative of the crown of creation won't get you any respect. The lab specialized in forensic sculpting, such as facial reconstructions from the skulls of unidentified murder victims. In a corner of the basement, my host revealed a rough-hewn face that they were trying to keep under wraps. I wasn't even allowed to take a picture. They had tried their hand at a Neanderthal skull, and the resulting bust so easily resembled one of the most powerful Duma parliament members that they feared he would close down their institute if a picture ever saw the light of day. We don't have a particularly high opinion of our next of kin, and certainly don't want to look like them. Neanderthals are depicted as stooped retards, running in and out of caves and dragging their wives behind them by their hair. The latest discovery, the small hobbit from the Indonesian island Flores, is considered microcephalic, perhaps even a cretin. Scientists blame thyroid problems caused by lack of iodine, but most of us go by the dictionary definition of a cretin as a stupid, obtuse, or mentally defective person. Never mind that sophisticated tools were found close to the Flores fossil. Staging the unsightly fights they're known for, anthropologists are still pondering the Flores evidence. But the situation of Neanderthals is getting clearer by the day. The traditional stereotype that they are dumb brutes never made much sense, given that their brain size exceeded ours. The Duma members' resemblance rather tells us something about our own Neanderthal background. When early humans traveled out of Africa, they encountered close relatives who had already spent 250,000 years up north. Their relatives were far better adapted to the freezing cold. Instead of us conquering them, as the story goes, we may have befriended the Northerners. Men must have thought Neanderthal women were hot. Women must have fancied Neanderthal men, and the other way around, because it is estimated that up to 4% of the DNA of non-African members of our species stems from Neanderthals. The crossbreeding probably boosted our immune system. Our northern brethren buried their dead, were skilled toolmakers, kept fires going, and took care of the infirm just like early humans. The fossil record shows survival into adulthood of individuals afflicted with dwarfism, paralysis of the limbs, or the inability to chew. Going by exotic names such as Shanadar I, Romito II, the Windover Boy, and the Old Man of La Chapelle-aux-Saints. Our ancestors supported individuals who contributed little to society. Survival of the weak, the handicapped, the mentally retarded, and others who posed a burden is seen by paleontologists as a milestone in the evolution of compassion. This communitarian heritage is crucial in relation to this book's theme, since it suggests that morality predates current civilizations and religions by at least 100 millennia. This is not the only date that is being pushed back, though. It's a safe assumption that, ranging from the brewing of beer to expressions of art, things always happened earlier than thought. South African ochre pieces engraved with complex geometrical patterns are twice as old as the cave paintings in Lascaux, France. Even bipedal locomotion keeps getting pushed back, for example, by the discovery of footprints showing a fully upright gait twice as long ago than previously assumed. Our first assumption is invariably that what we do and are proud of must be a recent development. Then we discover that Neanderthals did the same, and perhaps Australopithecines too, until we go back in time, all the way to the apes, which may in fact have been the first. Who says, for example, that the Stone Age started in our lineage? By means of archaeological techniques, a more than 4,000-year-old nut-cracking site with hammer and anvil stones was unearthed in Ivory Coast, but the kind of nuts found, the size of the tools, large and heavy, and the ecology, rainforest, hint at chimpanzee users, rather than at human ones. Analysis of the excavation suggests that for thousands of years, apes have been bringing durable stones, such as granite, from distant outcrops to smash hardy nuts in the forest. Today, the same tool technology is well known among West African chimpanzees. The Long Farewell. There is only one date that, rather than being pushed back, has been creeping closer and closer. In the first half of the preceding century, evolutionary trees and textbooks still show the human branch proudly growing on its own for 25 million years. Our immediate family consists of the four great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, and the so-called lesser apes, gibbons and siamongs. This is a tiny family compared with the 200 species of monkeys and prosimians in the primate order. With their tails and protruding snouts, monkeys are more distant from us than the apes are. The old tree, which put us far apart from all other primates, was not to last, however. Carl Linnaeus may already have foreseen this when he assigned humanity its own separate genus, Homo. The story goes that the Swedish taxonomist had his doubts about our special status, but decided to avoid trouble with the Vatican. 3 centuries later, the analysis of blood proteins and DNA offered a better way of comparing species than the anatomical comparisons used until then. The new data placed us apart from the monkeys, but smack in the middle of the apes. This was a shocker. But DNA is hard to argue with, because it avoids the problem of humans picking and choosing traits they like to emphasize. We may think that walking on 2 legs is a big deal, yet in the larger scheme of nature it really isn't. Chickens do it too. DNA comparisons circumvent human bias. In a DNA-based tree, humanity occupies just one tiny branch among many, having split off from the apes around 6 million years ago. If crossbreeding toward the end of the road, such as with the Neanderthals, fueled our species' success, the same may have applied to the beginning. Human and ape DNAs show signs of early hybridization. After having split off, our ancestors probably kept returning to the apes in the same way known today of grizzlies and polar bears or wolves and coyotes. Some paleontologists are skeptical, calling it unlikely that our bipedal ancestors kept breeding for over 1 million years with apes that walked on all fours, but to my knowledge the way you walk says little about whether you can mate or not. It makes me think of an even more puzzling assertion from before we knew about human Neanderthal hybridization, which was that we could safely rule out sex between those two hominins, since they obviously didn't speak the same language. I had to chuckle at this, thinking about when my French wife and I first met. Language is such a minor barrier. The first to propose human descent from the apes was the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in 1809. According to Lamarck's theory, acquired characteristics such as the stretching of legs by wading birds can be passed on to the next generation. Long before Darwin touched the subject, Lamarck envisioned human evolution from a quadrumanous, four-handed primate. If some race of quadrumanous animals, especially one of the most perfect of them, were to lose, by force of circumstances or some other cause, the habit of climbing in trees and grasping branches, and if the individuals of this race were forced for a series of generations to use their feet only for walking, and to give up using their hands like feet, these quadrumanous animals would at length be transformed into bimanous, and the thumbs of their feet would cease to be separated from the other digits. Lamarck paid dearly for his audacity. He made himself so many enemies that he died in penury, and was the subject of one of the most mocking and demeaning obituaries ever read before the Académie des Sciences. Half a century later, human descent from apes was popularized by two champions of Darwinian evolution, the kind based on inherited traits, Thomas Henry Huxley in England and Ernst Haeckel in Germany. Those two fought hard to get people to accept that we are modified apes, and they convinced at least the scientific community, in which this isn't a point of discussion anymore. Except, that is, when in 2009 Kent State University came out with a press release under the shocking headline, "Man did not evolve from apes." To understand this claim, one needs to know that Kent State had been involved in the discovery of Ardipithecus ramidus, also known as Ardi, a 4.4 million-year-old fossil from Ethiopia. This puts Ardi 1 million years closer to the long goodbye between humans and apes than previous fossils. One sign that Ardi was still rather ape-like is her opposable big toe. She must have been a great climber, who slept in trees the way apes still do every night to avoid predators. Inevitably, creationists and intelligent designers jumped on the misleading press release as a gift from God, while media outlets concluded that this must mean that apes descend from us. The confusion arose because a scientist on the Ardi team, despite being blessed with the bonobo-like name of Owen Lovejoy, could think only of chimps as a comparison. He concluded that Ardi's physique was too different to have come from a chimp-like forebear. But why take any living ape as starting point? The apes that are around today have had as much time to change as our own species has had since we split. People often think that the apes must have stood still while we evolved, but genetic data in fact suggest that chimpanzees changed more than we did. We simply don't know what our last common ancestor looked like. The rainforest doesn't permit fossilization. Everything rots away before it gets to this point, which is why we lack early ape fossils. Nevertheless, we can be sure that our progenitor would fit the common definition of an ape, a large, tailless, flat-chested primate with grasping feet. It remains perfectly acceptable, therefore, to say that we descend from apes, just not from any of the current ones. Ardi's less protruding mouth and relatively small blunt teeth clearly set her apart from the chimpanzee, in which males are equipped with long, sharp canines. These fangs serve as deadly knives, capable of slashing open an enemy's face and skin. Wild chimps use this weaponry to lethal effect in territorial combat. In comparison, Ardi is thought to have been relatively peaceful, perhaps because of reduced male-to-male conflict. Lovejoy even proposed that Ardi and her contemporaries were monogamous, and that this helped them suppress violence. But unless paleontologists come up with a male and female fossil with wedding rings on, the idea that Ardi was pair-bonded remains pure speculation. Moreover, there is no evidence that monogamy fosters peacefulness. The only pair-bonded primate we have in our immediate lineage, the gibbon, has formidable canine teeth. What if we descend not from a blustering chimp-like ancestor, but from a gentle, empathic, bonobo-like ape? The bonobo's body proportions, its long legs and narrow shoulders, seem to perfectly fit the descriptions of Ardi, as do its relatively small canines. Why was the bonobo overlooked? What if the chimpanzee, instead of being an ancestral prototype, is in fact a violent outlier in an otherwise relatively peaceful lineage? Ardi is telling us something, and there may exist little agreement about what she is saying, but I hear a refreshing halt to the drums of war that have accompanied all previous scenarios. The typecasting of our ancestors and relatives often has political overtones, which turned humorous in the hands of the comedian Stephen Colbert on The Colbert Report. It's quite an experience to go on a show, the main purpose of which is to make fun of you and your ideas. Colbert asked me how chimpanzees and bonobos stack up against each other. While I explained bonobo behavior, he kept pulling disgusted faces. They clearly were too peaceful and sexy for his taste. What about regular, straight as God intended it sex? But he nodded with approval when I described chimpanzees, which perfectly fit his law and order character. In a world divided by chimpophiles and bonobophiles, we all had a good laugh when Stephen peeled his banana. Bonobos, left and right. Imagine you're a writer, and you have decided to offer your readers a first-hand account of the politically correct primate, the idol of the left, known for its gay relations, female supremacy, and pacific lifestyle. Your focus is the bonobo, a close relation of the chimpanzee. You travel all the way to a place ironically called the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, to see these darling apes frolic in their natural habitat, hoping to come back with new and exciting stories. Alas, you barely get to see any bonobos. You watch a few of them quietly sitting in the trees, eating nuts. That's all. This is what happened to Ian Parker, who nevertheless managed to write 13 pages of carefully crafted prose as a far-flung correspondent for The New Yorker. We learn about the hot, soupy air, the rainstorms, the mudstreams, the sound of falling fruit shells, and his German host, whom he describes as rather cold and unsympathetic. Parker's main message could of course have been that field work is no picnic, but instead he insisted that bonobos were not nearly as nice and erotic as people think. Given that this ape's reputation has been a thorn in the side of homophobes, as well as Hobbesians, the right-wing media jumped with delight. The bonobo myth could finally be put to rest, and nature remain red in tooth and claw. The conservative commentator Dinesh D'Souza accused liberals of having fashioned the bonobo into their mascot, and he urged them to stick with the donkey. This might all have been amusing if it hadn't been for the fact that these are not just political skirmishes. At issue is what we know. That bonobos can be aggressive is not in doubt. We know of fierce group attacks, mostly by females against males. Many such cases have been documented at zoos over the years, and have actually led to changes in how bonobos are being kept. Since separation of mothers and sons disrupts a protective bond, zoos are increasingly keeping them together. As I warned in my 1997 book, Bonobo, the Forgotten Ape, all animals are competitive by nature and cooperative only under specific circumstances. With regard to bonobo behavior in the field, there are few new discoveries. The DRC has only recently emerged from a bloody civil war that killed an estimated 5 million people, an atrocious situation that has not been conducive to primatological research. Knowledge about wild bonobos has been at a virtual standstill for over a decade. We have excellent field data from before that time, however. The most important observation, which has remained unchanged over the last 3 decades, is that there are no confirmed reports of lethal aggression among bonobos. For chimpanzees, in contrast, we have dozens of cases of adult males killing other males, of males killing infants, of females killing infants, and so on. This is in the wild. In captivity, I myself documented male chimpanzees brutally mutilating and castrating a political rival, which led to his death. There is absolutely no dearth of such information on chimpanzees, which contrasts sharply with the 0 incidents in bonobos. Reviewing the violence of chimpanzees in Demonic Males, Richard Wrangham went on to draw the following comparison with bonobos. We can think of them as chimpanzees with a 3-fold path to peace. They have reduced the level of violence in relations between the sexes, in relations among males, and in relations between communities. None of this is to say that bonobos live in a fairy tale. They engage in sex for peace precisely because they have plenty of conflicts. What would be the point of peacemaking if they lived in perfect harmony? Sexual conflict resolution typically occurs among females, but also among males, such as at the San Diego Zoo. Vernon regularly chased Kayland into the dry moat. After such incidents, the 2 males had almost 10 times as many intensive contacts as normal for them. Vernon would rub his scrotum against Kayland's buttocks, or Kayland would present his penis for masturbation. The contrast with their fellow species is striking. Most observed chimp killings take place during territorial disputes, whereas bonobos engage in sex at their boundaries. They can be unfriendly to neighbors, but soon after a confrontation has begun, females have been seen rushing to the other side to copulate with males or mount other females. Since it is hard to have sex and wage war at the same time, the scene rapidly turns into socializing. It ends with adults from different groups grooming each other while their children play. These reports go back to 1990 and come mainly from Takayoshi Kano, the Japanese scientist who worked the longest with wild bonobos. Writing Bonobo, I interviewed field workers such as Kano and Parker's host, Gottfried Hohmann. When I asked the latter how his bonobos react to other groups, Hohmann replied, "It starts out very tense, with shouting and chasing, but then they settle down, and there is female and male-female sex between members of the 2 communities. Grooming may occur, but remains tense and nervous." This is not exactly the stuff associated with killer apes, although Hohmann did add that communities do not always mingle, and that males from different groups don't groom each other. At a sanctuary near Kinshasa, it was recently decided to merge 2 bonobo groups that had lived separately, just so as to create some activity. No one would ever dream of doing such a thing with chimpanzees, because the only possible outcome would be violence. It is well known at zoos that chimpanzee strangers need to be kept apart at all costs until they have become acquainted. Otherwise, one may be facing a bloodbath. The bonobos at the sanctuary, however, produced an orgy instead. They mixed freely, turning potential enemies into friends. To top it all off, there are the observations by Isabel Benque, a Chilean primatologist who studies bonobo play behavior at Wamba, the site where Kano and other Japanese scientists have worked for decades. Isabel couldn't believe her eyes when she saw individuals of different groups play together. She recently showed me videos taken in dense forest of an adult male surrounded by juveniles from a neighboring group who were poking him, climbing on top of him, and dangling around him. It was all in fun, without a grain of danger or hostility. She also showed a game between a male and a female from an outside group, in which the female followed the male and grasped his testicles while both of them ran around and around a tree, again without any obvious tension. A bit of a playful character herself, Isabel joked that this is where the expression, holding him by the balls, must derive from. Part of the confusion about aggressiveness of bonobos comes from their predatory behavior. While not on the scale of that of chimps, it is well developed. Bonobos kill small game, such as duikers, forest antelopes, squirrels, and immature monkeys, and sometimes hunt in groups. The problem is that this has little to do with aggressiveness. Already in the 1960s, Konrad Lorenz warned that a cat hissing at another cat is not the same as a cat stalking a mouse. The first expresses a mixture of fear and aggression. The second is motivated by hunger. We know now that the neutral circuitry is different. This is why Lorenz defined aggression as within-species behavior, and why herbivores are not considered any less aggressive than carnivores, as anyone who has witnessed a stallion fight can attest. Confusing predation with aggression is an old error that recalls the time when humans were seen as incorrigible murderers on the basis of signs that our ancestors ate meat. This killer ape notion gained such traction that the opening scene of Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001: A Space Odyssey showed one hominin bludgeoning another with a zebra femur, after which the weapon, flung triumphantly into the air, turned into an orbiting spacecraft. A stirring image, but based on a single puncture wound in the fossilized skull of an ancestral infant known as the Taung child. Its discoverer had concluded that our ancestors must have been carnivorous cannibals, an idea that the journalist Robert Ardrey repackaged in African Genesis by saying that we are risen apes rather than fallen angels. It is now considered likely, however, that the Taung child had merely fallen prey to a leopard or eagle. Glorification of violence stands in contrast to our coyness about sex, which has led scientists either to ignore it or to label it something else. In the same way that we prefer euphemisms, calling a toilet a restroom or the unintended exposure of a nipple a wardrobe malfunction, the literature customarily calls bonobos very affectionate, while in fact referring to behavior that, if conducted in the human public sphere, would promptly get you arrested. Two females may be pressing their swollen genitals together, rapidly rubbing them laterally in a pattern known as genito-genital rubbing, but Homan, who has seen this pattern many times, wonders, but does it have anything to do with sex? Probably not. Of course they use the genitals, but is it erotic behavior or a greeting gesture that is completely detached from sexual behavior? Fortunately, a U.S. court settled this monumental issue in the Paula Jones case against President Bill Clinton. It clarified that the term sex includes any deliberate contact with the genitalia, anus, groin, breast, inner thigh, or buttocks. We may quibble with this definition. If someone deliberately sits on me, thus touching me with his or her buttocks, does this need to be sexual? But let's focus on the genitals, which are obviously made for sex. When bonobos stimulate each other by grabbing testicles, fingering clitorises, or rubbing genitals together while squealing and showing other signs of apparent orgasm, Any sex therapist will tell you that they are doing it. I'm thinking here of Susan Block, an American therapist who teaches the bonobo way of peace through pleasure, which seems an appropriate slogan given that, apart from our own species, no other animal is as much into sex as the bonobo. How dramatically bonobos differ from chimpanzees was highlighted by a recent experiment on cooperation. Brian Hare and co-workers presented apes with a platform that they could pull close by working together. When food was placed on it, the bonobos outperformed the chimpanzees. The presence of food normally induces rivalry, but the bonobos engaged in sexual contact, played together, and happily shared the food side by side. The chimpanzees, by contrast, had trouble overcoming their competitiveness. For two species to react so differently to the exact same setup leaves little doubt about a temperamental difference. Another piece of evidence comes from a comparison of ape orphans by Vanessa Woods. Sadly, both chimps and bonobos are frequent victims of bushmeat hunting in Africa. Adults are typically sold as meat, whereas infants often end up in sanctuaries where humans lovingly care for them until they're strong enough to fend for themselves. Woods made a detailed comparison of infants of both species and found that bonobo infants engage in sexual contact at moments of excitement, such as when they are being fed, whereas chimp infants don't. The species difference therefore shows up extremely early in life. In short, so long as we dare to call sex sex and focus on known levels of within-species as opposed to between-species violence, there remains strong support for the claim that bonobos are relatively peaceful and that sexual behavior serves non-reproductive functions, including breeding, conflict resolution, and food sharing. The occasional hyperbole, for example, chimpanzees are from Mars, bonobos are from Venus, may be going too far, but no one would ever have heard of the species had it been described as merely affectionate. Whatever we find out in the years to come, with bonobo field workers returning to Africa, a Hobbesian makeover of the species is not to be expected anytime soon. I just can't see this ape go from being a gentle, sexy primate to being a nasty, violent one. The only scientist who has extensively studied both chimpanzees and bonobos in the forest, the Japanese primatologist Takeshi Furuichi, said it best: "With bonobos, everything is peaceful. When I see bonobos, they seem to be enjoying their lives." Paradise of Lust. As a student, I visited a now-defunct Dutch zoo that kept pygmy chimpanzees, which is the old name for bonobos. It was the first time I'd seen the species. I was struck by the contrast in behavior, demeanor, and appearance with chimpanzees. Chimps are brawny bodybuilders, whereas these apes looked rather intellectual. With their thin necks and piano-player hands, they seemed to belong in the library rather than the gym. At the time, almost nothing was known about bonobos, and I decided on the spot that this had to change. I had been led to believe that bonobos were just a smaller version of the chimpanzee, which was patently wrong. That day, I witnessed a minor squabble over a cardboard box, in which a male and a female ran around and pummeled each other, when all of a sudden their fight was over and they were making love. This seemed odd. I was used to chimpanzees who don't switch so easily from anger to sex. I thought that it was a coincidence or that I had missed something that would explain the change of heart, but it turned out that what I had seen was perfectly normal for these Kama Sutra primates. I learned this only years later, however, after I had begun working with them. Even if becoming a primate sexologist was never my goal, It was an inevitable consequence. I have seen them do it in all positions one can imagine, and even in some that we find hard to imagine, such as upside down, hanging by their feet. The most significant point about bonobo sex is how utterly casual it is, and how well integrated with social life. This is not how most of us look at our love life, since we are all full of hang-ups, obsessions, and inhibitions. Some people can't even do it with the lights on. This is why everyone winks at me when I say I work with bonobos, as if it must be a thrill, a forbidden pleasure that I get to enjoy. But the more one watches bonobos, the more sex begins to look like checking your email, blowing your nose, or saying hello, a routine activity. We use our hands in greetings, such as when we shake hands or pat each other on the back, while bonobos engage in genital handshakes. Their sex is remarkably short, counted in seconds, not minutes. We associate intercourse with reproduction and desire, but in the bonobo it fulfills all sorts of needs. Gratification is by no means always the goal, and reproduction only one of its functions. This explains why all partner combinations engage in it. In discussing this multifunctionality, it's hard not to notice that some people hate it and some love it. The hate relates to established views about the role of male hierarchies, territoriality and violence in human evolution, which is no doubt why anthropologists keep ignoring the bonobo. They have no room for primate hippies in our past. Bonobophilia is not necessarily more rational, however. It often reflects wishful thinking that is based on an idealized image of our ancestors. After lectures on bonobos, I sometimes run into polyamorists who feel they have much in common with the species, or people who tell me they dream of being more like bonobos. Others speculate that we must be the direct descendants, while implying that we should become matriarchal and throw off our sexual straitjackets. The association of our ancestors with free love has a biblical undertone. Not that the Bible encourages promiscuity, but it tells us that before the fall, we didn't know any better. Other primates are sometimes viewed as living innocent lives in a pristine environment, the way we envision Eden. They are thought to know no sexual bounds. There is even an official theory about this by the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who proposed that human civilization started with the incest taboo. Before that time, we did it with everyone, regardless of whether we were blood relatives or not. The incest taboo pushed us into a new realm, from the natural into the cultural. How off the mark was Lévi-Strauss? Suppression of inbreeding, as biologists call it, is well developed in all sorts of animals, from fruit flies and rodents to primates. It is close to a biological mandate for sexually reproducing species. In bonobos, father-daughter sex is prevented by females leaving around puberty to join neighboring communities. And mother-son sex is wholly absent, despite the fact that sons stick around and often travel with their mothers. It is the only partner combination free of sex in bonobo society, and all of this sans taboos. Starting with Rousseau's Noble Savage, prehistory is often reconstructed from an insouciant perspective in which we all happily get along without a moment's worry about tomorrow. Margaret Mead seemed drawn to this view when she described Samoan love life, and a recent BBC documentary pasted this particular Western prejudice onto an untouched Amazonian tribe. Two anthropologists familiar with the Peruvian Matzigenka community claim that the entire documentary was fabricated. It started with the way members of the film crew entered the village. They veered off a well-traveled path so that they could film themselves hacking their way through the jungle to find these elusive people. The documentary is said to be full of egregious mistranslations that turn innocuous remarks, "You come from far away where the gringos live," into fierce statements, "We use arrows to kill outsiders." When the old village chief wistfully says, "I will have sex another day," the translation reads, "I have sex every day." Imagination runs amok as soon as we think of human origins. We picture ancestors without culture, before language, with hardly any technology, and a minimum of sexual constraints. It sounds rather unrealistic, but 2 centuries before Rousseau, people were getting ready for this genre of origin fantasies, as is evident from the almost simultaneous appearance of the English humanist Thomas More's Utopia and Bosch's Garden. More's world included a welfare state, lack of private property, and euthanasia, but it lacked free love. In fact, premarital sex was punished in Utopia by a lifetime of celibacy. Bosch's fantasy, in contrast, showed us a happy mass of undressed men and women frolicking around in the garden's central panel, indulging both their palates and their genitals. What did the painter try to tell us? The traditional interpretation is that his triptych shows the corruption of innocence followed by hellish punishment in the right-hand panel. It seems straightforward. Sex is sin, and sinners belong in hell. If true, the garden's moral outlook doesn't differ much from Utopia's. But we know now that Bosch's painting reveals its secrets only reluctantly. Together with Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, which dates from the same time, it is probably the most written-about work of art ever. It appears new to every successive generation, often revealing more about the generation's era than about the painting itself. The Paradise panel on the left shows God gently holding Eve's wrist with his left hand while blessing her union with Adam with his right hand. Adam stares at Eve with what has been described as sexual arousal. For this to be true, however, and speaking as a primatologist here, I would have preferred to see an erection. Yet Adam's member appears as unanimated as a sleeping mouse. Google Earth lets anyone violate Adam's privacy. His facial expression rather seems astonished, as if no one had ever told him that he was going to meet a woman. The first couple meets in a most unusual setting, full of invented creatures and recently discovered animals, giraffes, porcupines. In the distance we see a snake curling around a sort of nut tree, but the snake is in fact dropping out of the tree, and Adam and Eve don't eat any fruits. Indeed, the garden shows us Eden with neither a fall nor an expulsion. It took art historians a couple of centuries to figure out that the horizon in the middle panel is continuous with that of the left-hand side, suggesting that the central scene, with over 1,000 nudes engaged in erotic amusement, must be taking place in paradise too. Is this what might have become of humanity had we never been kicked out? Would resistance to temptation have been rewarded with sexual freedom? In the words of one art critic, the swarms of men riding donkeys, camels, and 4-legged birds around pools with bathing ladies exhibit a certain adolescent sexual curiosity. This is precisely how bonobos have been described by me and others. The species seems an immature version of the chimpanzee in the same way that humans are considered a forever young primate. Neoteny, or the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood, is considered the hallmark of our species. It is recognizable in our enduring playfulness, inquisitiveness, and creativity, and also in our imaginative sexuality. The garden offers a perfect illustration, and since it abounds with all sorts of animals, I wager that Bosch, had he known bonobos, would not have hesitated to insert a few among the cavorting masses. They'd have fit in far better than chimps. Some have related Bosch's intentions to the 4th century Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, which speaks of the paradisum voluptatis, or the paradise of lust. Bosch undoubtedly knew this translation by St. Jerome, his namesake, whom he admired so much that he painted him twice. Early theologians were embarrassed by the Vulgate's reference to lust, pleasure, and enjoyment, but couldn't deny that God had created humans in two versions with complementary genitals. His well-known injunction to be fruitful and multiply could not possibly be carried out without sex, and the gratification that comes with it. Bosch may have taken all of this quite literally, while adding some deliberate provocation. One popular speculation is that he was part of a heretical sect, the so-called Brethren and Sisters of the Free Spirit, which sought a return to humanity's original purity, including nudity and promiscuity. Trying to achieve the innocence of Adam before the fall, members of this sect were known as Adamites. There is no corroborating evidence, however, that Bosch was in fact an Adamite. The sect had entirely disappeared from view by the time he was born. More likely, he was influenced by early humanism, which was considerably less sex-averse than the Church. The so-called Prince of the Humanists, Erasmus of Rotterdam, even stayed in Den Bosch to study Latin, living just a few houses down from the Bosch residence in the same street. It is tempting to speculate that those two satirizing moralists got to know each other. Erasmus was crystal clear on sexuality. I have no patience with those who say that sexual excitement is shameful and that venereal stimuli have their origin not in nature but in sin. Nothing is so far from the truth. As if marriage, whose function cannot be fulfilled without these incitements, did not rise above blame. In other living creatures, where do these incitements come from? From nature or from sin? This is quite a statement for the 16th century. It was all part of the moral and religious debates raging during the Northern Renaissance. Bosch's oeuvre offered penetrating commentary. The painter's popular image may be as the morbid painter of punishment, the master of the monstrous, the discoverer of the unconscious, as the psychoanalyst Carl Jung called him. But it is good to realize that among the tormented figures in the right-hand panel of the garden, we don't recognize any of the lovebirds from the center. There are references to lust and sex, but most of the depicted vices relate to gambling, greed, gossiping, sloth, gluttony, pride, and so on. It is almost as if the painter is saying that, yes, the world is full of misery and sin will be punished, but don't look at carnal love as its source. Sisterhood is powerful. Vernon, a male bonobo at the San Diego Zoo, ruled a small group that included one female, Loretta, who was his maiden friend, and a couple of juveniles. It was the only time I have seen a bonobo group run by a male. At the time, I thought this must be the norm. After all, male dominance is typical of most mammals, and male bonobos are definitely larger and more muscular than females. But Loretta was relatively young, and she was the only female. As soon as a second one was added, the power balance shifted. The first thing Loretta and the other female did upon meeting was engage in sex with big grins on their faces, squealing loudly, leaving little doubt that apes know sexual pleasure. These lesbian encounters became more and more frequent, spelling the end of Vernon's rule. Months later, the typical scene at feeding time was both females having sex and sharing the food. The only way for Vernon to get any was to beg with outstretched hand. What a contrast with chimpanzee groups, in which every healthy male dominates every female. Female dominance is also typical of wild bonobos, as Furuichi explains. When females approached males who were feeding in a preferred position at a feeding site, males yielded their positions to late-arriving females. Furthermore, males usually waited at the periphery of the feeding site until females finished eating. When overt conflict occurred, Allied females sometimes chased males, but males never formed aggressive alliances against females. Even the alpha male might retreat when approached by middle or low-ranking females. One way to look at this unusual society is that it evolved to keep the young safe. Male chimpanzees occasionally kill infants of their species, and humans are not much better. Abuse and death may occur in the family home, but also on a larger scale, as when King Herod sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all its borders from 2 years old and under. Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Nothing like this happens in bonobos, either on a small or on a large scale. The reason is that, first of all, being the dominant sex helps mothers defend their children. Second, rampant sex makes every adult male potentially the father of every youngster. Not that male bonobos know about paternity, but what could possibly be worse than killing your own progeny? Such behavior is sure to be selected against, which is why promiscuity protects the young. This is visible in the behavior of new bonobo mothers. Instead of staying away from large gatherings, as chimp mothers wisely do, they join their group right away after having given birth. Bonobo mothers act as if they have nothing to fear. Against this background, the only report of fierce violence among wild bonobos makes sense. Holman and his wife Barbara Fruit witnessed a dark incident in Lomaco Forest concerning a young male named Folker. Folker had the luck that his mother, Kamba, was alpha female of the Ayengo community in which he was born. Bonobo males hang on to their mother's apron strings. As soon as Folker got into trouble with other males or was chased by females, his mother would step in, giving him a break. While growing up, Folker steadily improved his position among the males, climbing the social ladder with maternal support. He also developed a close friendship with a particular female named Amy. Soon after Amy had given birth to her first offspring, however, an unexpected episode happened while a large number of bonobos foraged in a garcinia tree loaded with thousands of shiny sweet fruits. Folker jumps on the branch that holds Amy and her baby. For a second, the female seems to lose balance, but then maintains a firm grip and pushes Folker off the branch. The male jumps to the ground and is followed by a screaming Amy. The descent of Folker and Amy initiates a rush, as other adult females and males drop out of the tree, and within seconds the forest transforms into a battleground. Details are camouflaged by the dense vegetation, but the frightening noise of screaming bonobos indicates that this is not a mock fight, but a fierce struggle. The coordinated attack by 15 or more apes was entirely aimed at Folker, who ended up being dragged about. He was eventually found on the ground, desperately clinging to a tree with both hands and feet, his face contorted into a panicky grimace. All bonobos were agitated, having their hair on end and vocalizing, while warning off human observers with alarm barks, as if they didn't want them to get close. The faces of the bonobos showed emotions that Holman and Fruit had never seen before. The most surprising was that Amy, who was rather low-ranking, could trigger such a mass assault, while Kamba stayed entirely out of it. Normally, Kamba would have been the first to defend her son, but when the field workers went looking for her after the incident, they found her hiding high up in the canopy. The field workers think that Folker may have threatened Amy's infant. Had he tried to snatch it away, the way chimpanzee males sometimes do? If so, Folker misjudged the community's protectiveness. A male who tries to lay hands on an infant is apparently in for the most dreadful punishment. The sudden outbreak of violence suggests a deeper layer to bonobo society, one normally covered by its Woodstock facade. It resembles a moral code to defend the interests of the most vulnerable. If violated, The code is so massively enforced that even the highest echelons of society, such as the alpha female, won't dare go against it. Bonobo solidarity is made possible by a habitat that permits more social cohesion than that of chimpanzees. In their quest for dispersed food, chimps need to split up into small parties or travel long distances alone. Bonobos are different. They stay together, wait for those who have slowed down, and join a chorus of sunset calls to bring the community together, while building night nests high up in the trees. They obviously love company. Access to enormous fruiting trees as well as abundant nutritious herbs on the forest floor support their close-knit society, the core of which is a secondary sisterhood. I call it secondary since female bonding isn't based on kinship. Being the migratory sex, females are largely unrelated within any given community. Fascination with infants is, of course, typical of all mammals. But one striking encounter illustrates how much bonobos care. A co-worker of mine, Amy Parrish, had gotten to know several female bonobos at a zoo. These females embraced Amy as one of them, something they never did with me, since apes make precise gender distinctions among people. Loretta might sexually solicit me from across the moat, turning her genital swelling to me while peeking between her legs. But being a male, I could never be part of the gynecocracy, that is a bonobo society. Amy, in contrast, once even got good food tossed at her, as if she must have been hungry. When Amy visited her bonobo friends years later, she wanted to show them her newborn son. From behind glass, the oldest female briefly glanced at Amy's baby, but then ran into an adjacent room. She quickly returned to hold her own baby up against the glass, so that the two infants could look into each other's eyes. An empathic brain. In comparing bonobo society with ours, I see too many differences to fall for bonobo-inspired wishful thinking. I don't believe their free love would necessarily suit us. For one thing, evolution has given us our own way of protecting the young, which is exactly the opposite of the bonobos. Instead of diluting paternity, humans fall in love and often commit to one person, at least one at a time. Through marriage and morally enforced fidelity, many societies try to clarify which males fathered which offspring. It is a highly imperfect attempt, with lots of philandering and uncertainties, but one that has taken us into quite a different direction. Universally, human males share resources with mothers and offspring, and help out with child care, which is virtually unheard of in bonobos and chimpanzees. Most importantly, male partners offer protection against other males. In considering what we share with our ape relatives, the easiest comparison is in fact between male chimpanzees and men. Chimpanzee males hunt together, form coalitions against political rivals, and collectively defend a territory against hostile neighbors, yet at the same time they vie for status and compete for females. This tension between bonding and rivalry is very familiar to human males on sports teams and in corporations. Men intensely compete among themselves while still realizing that they need each other to prevent their team from going under. In You Just Don't Understand, the linguist Deborah Tannen reports how men use conflict to negotiate status, and actually enjoy sparring with friends. When things have gotten heated, they make up with a joke or apology. Businessmen, for example, will shout and bully at a meeting, only to take a restroom break during which they joke and laugh it all off. The fuzzy line between conflict and cooperation is not always understood by women, for whom a friend and a rival are totally different things. but it is second nature to me since I grew up in a family of 6 boys and no girls. In fact, my interest in how chimpanzees reconcile after fights came about partly because I refused to view aggression as inherently evil, which was the prevailing opinion when I began my studies. Aggressive behavior was even labeled asocial. I failed to follow this. I saw scuffles and fights as a way of negotiating relationships, and would call them destructive only if inhibitions were lacking or if no one attempted a repair afterwards. Chimpanzee males get along most of the time, and are indeed much better than females in reducing tensions through a long grooming session with their greatest rival. Holding grudges is not a male thing. But I also see similarities with bonobos, especially when it comes to empathy and the social functions of sex. Not that humans use sex as easily and publicly as bonobos, but within the human family, sex serves as a social glue similar to the way it smooths relations among bonobos. I consider bonobos highly empathic, more so than chimpanzees. As soon as one bonobo has even the smallest injury, he or she will be surrounded by others who come to inspect, lick, or groom. Robert Yerkes described in Almost Human how his bonobo took care of a gravely ill companion, saying that if he were to give a full description, he would probably be accused of idealizing an ape. It is only recently that we have learned how the brain of bonobos reflects this sensitivity. The first hint came from a special type of neuron, known as a spindle cell, thought to be involved in self-awareness, empathy, sense of humor, self-control, and other human fortes. Initially, these neurons were known only in humans, but following the usual pattern in science, they were subsequently also discovered in brains of apes, including bonobos. Then came a study that compared specific brain areas in chimpanzees and in bonobos. Areas involved in the perception of another's distress, such as the amygdala and anterior insula, are enlarged in the bonobo. Its brain also contains well-developed pathways to control aggressive impulses. Reporting these neurological differences, James Rilling and co-workers concluded that bonobos have empathic brains. We suggest that this neural system not only supports increased empathic sensitivity in bonobos, but also behaviors like sex and play that serve to dissipate tension, thereby limiting distress and anxiety to levels conducive with prosocial behavior. None of this was known when I first encountered bonobos, yet it confirmed that I was right to think they were different. The French call them left-bank chimpanzees, both for their alternative lifestyle and because they live on the south bank of the westward-streaming Congo River. This mighty river permanently cuts them off from chimpanzees and gorillas to the north. They share an ancestor with both of those apes, though, of which the one shared with chimps lived less than 2 million years ago. The $64,000 question is whether this ancestor was bonobo-like or chimp-like. In other words, which of the two apes is the more original type, closest in appearance and behavior to the sort of ape we derive from? For the moment, the safest bet is that chimps and bonobos are equally close to us, since they split from each other well after we split off from their ancestor. A common estimate is that we share 98.8% of our DNA with them, although other calculations put the number at only 95%. The recent publication of the bonobo genome confirms that we humans share genes with bonobos that we don't share with chimps. But we also share genes with chimps that we don't share with bonobos. While awaiting more precise DNA comparisons, it is clear that the argument that only chimps matter for the story of human evolution has now lost its footing. The bonobo is exactly equally relevant. Our species shares a mosaic of characteristics with both apes, or as I have said before, we are bipolar apes. On our good days, we are as nice as bonobos can be, while on our bad days, we are as domineering and violent as chimps can be. How our common ancestor behaved remains unknown, but bonobos offer essential insights. They never left the humid rainforest, whereas chimps radiated out to half-open woodland, and our own lineage left the forest altogether. So bonobos may have encountered the least reasons for evolutionary change, and retained more original traits. The American anatomist Harold Coolidge suggested the same when, in 1933, he concluded from his necropsies that bonobos resemble more closely to the common ancestor of chimpanzees and man than does any living chimpanzee.